The snowstorm swirled in a wild dance, beating against the walls of the gloomy castle. In front of the window, there was a table, and on it, on a small plate, rested a sandwich made with 2 slices of stale bread and jam. As she approached, the young woman took a box of matches from her pocket and lit one, taking the plate with the food. And blowing out the match, Hanny congratulated herself on her birthday. She was alone in that castle and desperately fought to survive. And today she turned 19. But even now, on this day, other people outside waited for the girl to die. That day was etched in her mind and left deep wounds in her heart. Back then, Emperor Frederick ordered honey transferred to Macleod Castle. But people considered that punishment too compassionate, remembering how her mother tried to poison the empress. Furthermore, at that time, they lost the imperial grandson she was expecting. So, the people began to plead with His Majesty to repeal the order and reconsider the severity of the punishment. With a scorching look, Frederick immediately ordered everyone to be silent, promising that, otherwise, he would send them along with Hanny to the castle. Confinement in the icy Macleod Castle was practically a death sentence. Frederick considered it the best alternative to his sister's execution, although she really hadn't done anything. The castle, surrounded by eternal winter, was atop a snowy mountain. That mountain, which was previously full of vegetation, froze about 500 years ago. At that time, the emperor back then defeated a dragon that possessed ice magic. When the imperial sword pierced the dragon's heart, an incredible force was unleashed. It froze the mountain in an instant, which caused the nearby villages to become covered in ice, and caused hundreds of victims, even after 500 years. The forest has not changed, preserving the horror of that incident as if it happened yesterday. But they hadn't only banished Han. And Jai, to her horror, somehow ended up acquiring the dragon's power. The girl sat down on the floor, resigned, thinking her life was simply horrible, and that, if God existed, He would never allow such a thing. She didn't know what else to expect from a life where she couldn't feel even a shred of warmth. Placing her hand over her heart, the protagonist burst into tears, convinced that people cannot live without warmth. And now, with the only thing she had left, she decided to commit her first sin, creating several ice spears in the air. The girl closed her eyes and prepared herself. A second later, lying in a puddle of her own blood. For the first time, she felt a pleasant warmth. And if there was truly someone who could hear her in that place, Haney only wished she had been born in a less cold place. Suddenly, the protagonist opened her eyes and found herself on a bed, jumping up and clutching her head. In front of the bed stood Haney's mother, Eleonora, who was screaming furiously at her daughter. Thinking she was useless, the protagonist thought perhaps these were memories before dying. But why that moment specifically? Without stopping her screaming, the woman approached the table and took the little girl's music box, smashing it against the floor. She decided that people like Haney should never have been born. The protagonist sighed bitterly, still not understanding why she had to see exactly that. Her mother screamed that every time she saw her daughter, she felt like she was walking through hell itself. Eleonora had been empress, but even that title did not satisfy her, and she soon fell into decline. After Frederick's coronation, the woman found herself cornered, and she vented all her fury on the baby. As a child, Hanny believed it was all her fault, so she remained silent and endured without making a sound. And now, finding herself there again, she realized how naive she had been. Seeing that her daughter was thoughtful, Eleonora became even more enraged. Approaching her, the mother turned her eyes with fury, completely beside herself with rage, slapping Hanny in the face. She was shocked that even such a creature considered her a joke. At that moment, the girl was very surprised to feel the pain in her cheek after the blow, starting to doubt whether she had really died. The protagonist suddenly felt a familiar power in her heart. Looking at her hand, she saw a blue glow gently enveloping her palm, realizing that she had returned to the past. And moreover, she had ice magic. Hanny was in shock. Eleonora was behind her, looking furiously at the girl, who wasn't even paying attention to her. Then, the woman concluded that even a useless person like her daughter looked down on her. Looking back, Hanny thought that if this was her punishment, it was too cruel. Meanwhile, a little boy with golden hair and golden eyes walked near the royal palace. Glancing to the side, his gaze fell upon something that confused him. A short while before, Hanny remembered how the maids brought a music box that His Majesty had gifted her. Eleonora thought that Frederick had gone mad deciding to give a gift to the princess. In front of the girl, she placed that music box on her room's table, waiting for night to fall, and making sure everyone was asleep. Hanny stealthily approached the gift. Turning on the music box, she enjoyed the pleasant sounds she hadn't heard since birth. And now that gift lay in pieces, right in front of the girl. The mother ordered her to remain silent in her room until the wounds healed. And if Hanny dared to go out, it would be at her own risk. However, Eleonora was sure that even if her daughter wanted to, she wouldn't have the courage to leave the room. After that, she started leaving the room, leaving the girl alone with her thoughts. Annie couldn't understand why she endured that, and why she continues to put up with it even now. Leaving the room with complete calmness, Eleonora suddenly noticed the princess quickly slipping past her. At that very moment, Hanny roughly pushed her mother, causing her to fall and hit herself painfully. While the woman and her servants recovered from the shock, the girl ran through the hallways, shouting for help. A few seconds later, Hanny heard her mother's scream behind her, ordering them to catch her. The wounds on the princess's body still hurt, and the girl didn't know where to run. She remembered that, when she lived in the snowy mountain, the emperor was the only one who gave her everything she needed. Understanding that only he could help her now, Hanny turned towards Frederick's chambers. But suddenly, female hands held her from all sides, filling the protagonist with terror. The maids were happy to have finally caught the fugitive princess, and intended to take her to their mistress. One of them was shocked by how fast the girl could run. Even in that condition, the little one wanted to scream for help. But suddenly, her mouth was covered by a hand. Another maid reminded her that if Hanny behaved well, Her Highness, the former empress, would forgive her. The protagonist understood that if they took her now, that would definitely be the end. For a second, the idea of freezing the maids with her ability occurred to the girl. But she immediately stopped, not wanting to turn into a monster. Even though she had that power, she tried to scream again, but the girls covered her mouth and started forcibly taking her away. Suddenly, Honey saw a little boy around the corner, with golden hair and eyes, who was in shock at what he saw. It was Oswald, the son of the current emperor, who could tell his father everything. However, he stood paralyzed with fear, while the maids continued dragging the girl back to the room. Drawing strength from nowhere, Honey tried to scream and ask for help, but it was all in vain. She only had to hope that the boy understood everything correctly and would immediately go tell his father. Having no energy left, the protagonist almost collapsed in the girl's arms. Looking at Oswald pleadingly, the boy looked back at her, completely confused by what was happening. The maids reported to the lady that everything went smoothly, and that they didn't run into anyone. Eleonora didn't care who intruded here, because in any case, none of this would reach Frederick's ears. Furious, she looked at her daughter, whose attempts had been useless. What bothered the woman most was that Brat dared to push her and run away. She decided to find out if Hanny really had the courage to defy her. In that case, she had to put the girl back in her place. So she grabbed her head with her hands. But suddenly, the maids' shouts were heard, saying that imperial knights were outside, leaving Eleonora in shock. The protagonist immediately understood that the boy had indeed told his father everything. Scared, the woman began to think frantically and ordered the room to be cleaned quickly. The little girl, already tied up, was stuffed into a closet, and her mouth was covered with tape. One of the maids received the order to watch the girl so she wouldn't make a single sound. Turning to Haney, Eleonora ordered her to play dead, because they still had things to discuss. After that, she closed the closet door, leaving the little girl in darkness, and hurried towards the knights. Finally, upon arriving at the location, the knights, led by Captain Drake, saluted His Highness. Drake was especially happy to know that the former empress was well. It turned out that Emperor Frederick had ordered them to check on His Highness. Princess Haney. Eleonora smiled ironically, not remembering when she and the emperor became close enough for visits. However, the captain didn't care, since he was only carrying out His Majesty's order. The woman pretended to understand his intentions, but now was not the time, because the princess was sleeping after etiquette class. Drake was perplexed. Did the lady intend to disobey the emperor's order? Eleonora was indignant at being asked to wake the little princess just for her to present herself before them. The soldiers apologized, since it was an order from His Majesty. But the woman didn't let them finish. Eleonora started screaming furiously, asking if, now that she was no longer empress, her words were worthless. She refused to show the girl unless Emperor Frederick himself came in person. Annie heard everything from the closet and prayed for some miracle, apologizing for the inconvenience. Drake and his men had no choice but to retreat. Hearing those words, a chill ran down the spine of the tied-up girl. Because if the knights simply left now, the princess's life would be no better than before. Suddenly, the hallway filled with the powerful voice of the emperor, who didn't understand what all the fuss was about. Expecting such behavior from the former empress, Frederick decided to come himself. Drake greeted His Highness with a bow, apologizing for not being able to resolve it alone. Eleonora didn't understand why such a busy person had to visit them. If he only wanted to ask about the princess's health, he could have chosen another day. But the emperor refused. Why had he come to see his younger sister? And did he need more reasons for that? The girl heard him demanding to be shown Princess Hanny immediately. Trying to make excuses, Eleonora was shocked by Frederick's insistence, who hadn't visited even once in the last 9 years. So now, he must have a weighty reason to insist on waking the sleeping girl. To the woman's horror, it turned out the emperor had received a report that some maids were forcibly dragging the princess. Feigning surprise, Eleonora acted as if she didn't understand His Majesty's words. The maids also pretended it was the first time they heard such a thing, and that they understood nothing. But Frederick just laughed, since he didn't expect all the employees to be involved in the conspiracy. At that very moment, he gave the order to search the palace and find His Highness, Princess Haney. The woman, horrified, started screaming, not understanding how they could make such a fuss over simple rumors. However, the young Crown Prince Oswald considered the former empress's words completely mistaken, because they weren't just rumors. He himself had witnessed the incident. Eleonora stood paralyzed with astonishment and fear while Frederick became enraged at his son, whom he had ordered to wait and not intervene. But Oswald thought that, since he was the first to see everything, he should stay until the end. The woman glared furiously at the insolent nobleman who dared to open his mouth. The emperor gave Eleonora one last chance to confess everything before the knights found the little girl. However, the woman kept insistently pretending she knew nothing, which made Frederick even angrier. The former empress was determined to remain silent until the end, no matter what happened. Moreover, putting on an innocent face, she didn't understand why the emperor was doing this to her. Suddenly, Oswald ordered the knight to open the closet in the corner of the room, thinking the girl might be there. Eleonora looked at him horrified, remaining motionless and feeling a chill of fear, hearing everything that was happening. Hanny looked hopefully towards the closed door, awaiting her rescuers. Suddenly, the darkness inside the closet was pierced by a thin ray of light filtering in from outside. Upon fully opening the door, everyone present saw a terrible scene. A scared and tied-up girl. Oswald joyfully extended his hand, greeting the girl, who had nothing more to fear. The first thing he did was free her from the ropes that were hurting her, and took her to his father. Annie couldn't believe what she saw upon finally coming face to face with the emperor. However, now she was determined to stop hesitating and start acting. Falling to her knees before Frederick, the girl started pleading with the emperor to protect her from her mother's attacks. Eleonora looked at her daughter stunned, not understanding how she could do that to her own mother. That scene was enough for the emperor to understand everything and to be filled with fury. The first thing he did was order the immediate arrest of the culprit and all of her maids, without taking his eyes off Frederick. Hanny heard the screams of the girls behind her as the knights approached. Suddenly, Oswald approached the girl and took her hand tenderly, which made the protagonist very nervous. After ensuring the culprits were tied up, the emperor turned towards the children. He wanted them to accompany him, leaving everything else to the knights. Just as the girl sighed in relief, she suddenly heard her mother's desperate scream. Eleonora was trembling with madness, not understanding if her punishment hadn't been enough. She immediately started insulting her daughter. But Drake covered her mouth with his hand. Frederick was glad to finally see the true face of that woman, who apparently feared nothing anymore. And since she herself had provoked it, the emperor ordered the captain to severely interrogate Eleonora. Turning towards the children, he understood that they must surely be in shock, and wanted to take them away as soon as possible. After that, he extended his hand towards Hanny, with the intention of stroking her head. Scared, the girl pulled her head back, covering it with her hands and closing her eyes. Seeing this, Frederick regretted his carelessness and apologized to his little sister. He didn't want to hurt her, and to prove it, he covered Annie with his imperial cloak. Knowing everything she had been through, the emperor wanted to carry the girl in his arms. Annie, still in shock, nodded insecurely, and immediately found herself in her highness's arms. After that, he called his son, who was sweetly smiling, looking at the protagonist. The father admired his bravery, but now they would have to talk about the boy's reckless outings. Annie received help, but all that warmth coming from the emperor felt so unfamiliar. Until now, she had been wilting alone in the icy palace. And now, was this really happening? Her thoughts were interrupted by Oswald, who was worried if the girl was okay. Looking into his eyes full of concern, the protagonist felt for the first time that someone cared about her. Embarrassed, she hid in Frederick's vest and awkwardly admitted that she was fine. She believed with all her heart that those kind looks would not just be a passing dream. And at that moment, what she wanted most was to enjoy that warmth a little longer. A little later, the emperor, his sister, and his son arrived safely at the palace. The head butler, Charles, accompanied by the servants, greeted His Highness, the son of the empire. At that moment, the man's gaze fell upon the injured girl in the emperor's arms. Observing her closely, he immediately thought they should call the imperial physician. Nodding in agreement, Frederick also wanted to know where the empresses were. Upon learning that both were in the hall, the emperor ordered the princess to be taken there after all the care. For a while, he decided to entrust her to the palace's personal maid, a young woman named Viola. Gently taking the princess, the maid greeted her and invited her to come along. Seeing this, Oswald began to beg his father to let him go with Haney. By agreeing, Frederick knew it would be difficult to get used to the relationship between the two of them, because at first glance, they looked like two children. But Haney, in reality, was Oswald's aunt. As he watched them leave, the emperor informed Charles that there would be unrest in the palace for a while. He thought Eleonora was hiding the girl out of excessive care, but it turned out to be much worse. Later, upon entering the hall, Frederick was greeted by his mother Constance and his wife Melissa. Both empresses were very worried, as they could not find Oswald anywhere. However, instead of giving explanations, the emperor wanted to discuss something with them. Meanwhile, Viola led the children to a room where a doctor would check on the princess later. Sitting on a chair, Hanny looked at herself in the mirror and concluded that she looked about 9 years old now. She remembered a broken music box she secretly turned on when everyone was asleep. At those times, the girl imagined growing up in a happy family, full of love and harmony. Just like Oswald, whose parents cared for him and protected him. Suddenly, Hanny noticed the boy's gaze, which was fixed on her wounds. A little embarrassed, she apologized to him, leaving the crown prince speechless. Oswald wondered, had the protagonist done something wrong? The girl was sure he had been surprised to see something he shouldn't have. So, instead of accepting apologies, the boy demanded that his aunt thank him for saving her. Those were his mother's words. And he, being an obedient son and good, remembered them very well. The protagonist felt a little uncomfortable by those words and looked closely at Oswald, blushing and covering her mouth with her hand. She thanked the hero insecurely, but sincerely for saving her. The boy's face suddenly changed, showing an expression of excited enthusiasm. Looking at him, Honey thought that if light were to become a person, it would surely look just like this. Suddenly, someone knocked on the door, and a female voice asked permission to enter. Oswald gave his consent, and Agnes, who was the imperial doctor, entered the room. The protagonist could barely believe she was seeing in person one of the 3 best doctors in the empire. In her past life, it was Agnes who saved the Empress after Eleonora poisoned her. To the doctor's dismay, Her Highness had to leave the room. It was necessary for the procedure, and she hoped the crown prince would understand. Leaving the door with Viola, Oswald asked Agnes not to hurt the protagonist. Sitting down in front of the girl and putting on her gloves, the doctor began to examine her hands. A normal child would have cried and tried to break free from the pain, but Hanny only made a small grimace. Very surprised, Agnes thought that this was how the girl faced all difficulties. When they finished, the princess's hands were completely bandaged. Suddenly, the girl became curious about whether she should show the scars she had under her clothes, which left the doctor in shock. Annie understood that the doctor had to report her condition to His Highness. Agnes was curious to know how the girl knew about her task, but the little one had only guessed it. However, she was very grateful to the Emperor, who worried about her and saved her from her mother. Annie decided that, for the sake of her future, she had to show all the scars left on her after living in the palace. Agnes was half in shock. Looking at the princess's trembling hands, the girl started unbuttoning the dress buttons insecurely, barely able to control the tremor. Unable to bear it any longer, the young woman took her hands, leaving the protagonist confused. But the doctor only wanted to help the young princess take off her clothes. After examining the scars on Her Highness's body, Agnes wrote in the report that the princess suffered abuse regularly. After receiving the necessary help, the girl finally went out to where Oswald and Viola were waiting. The boy immediately wanted to know how all the procedures went, and if she was okay. What worried him most was if the doctor had hurt the girl. Then Hanny reassured him, because thanks to him, it didn't hurt at all. For Oswald, that was the most important thing, and he suggested going to see his father immediately. Upon entering the room, the protagonist immediately felt the incredible weight of the atmosphere hanging in the air. It was not surprising, as the Emperor had surely already told the Empresses everything. Sitting on the sofa, the girl only wanted to know if everyone truly believed her. First of all, Frederick confessed that they had already read Agnes's report about her condition. Therefore, the Emperor wanted to personally thank her for the courage the little one had shown. Since he was present, an investigation was unnecessary, but proof was needed to strip Eleonora of her title. Melissa decided to interrupt her husband's speech, thinking they were there to listen to the princess. The Empress wanted the girl to tell them herself everything that had happened to her. Gathering courage, the protagonist recounted all the suffering her mother caused her. That took away her desire to live, living every day under oppression. She couldn't take it anymore and decided to escape. But they caught her. Frederick became furious upon hearing that, not understanding why the little girl didn't ask for help immediately. But he immediately reconsidered, because in reality, they should have figured everything out themselves. The protagonist remembered how her mother called her a disgusting monster, whom nobody wanted or would help. And even if Hanny told the emperor everything, it would be useless since she was the daughter of his worst enemy. For that very reason, the protagonist couldn't ask for help, which left Frederick completely bewildered. Constance held her head, in a state of shock from what she had just heard. The emperor began to blame himself for not suspecting anything when Eleonora's maids lied to his face. Now, he barely felt worthy to ask forgiveness for not understanding everything sooner. Oswald ran and hugged Hanny tightly, sang her name through tears. He never considered her a monster. On the contrary, he called those who hurt him that. But now, he firmly promised the princess that she would never feel pain again. Unable to contain herself, the girl burst into tears on his shoulder. Feeling protected, Melissa approached and hugged them tightly, completely supporting her son's words. Looking at the girl, the Empress understood how incredibly difficult it had been for her to face everything alone. Constance decided it was time to stop being lenient with Eleonora for her daughter's sake. Everyone agreed. And now they had to choose the punishment they would give the woman. At that moment, the children fell asleep on the sofa after so much emotion. After a while, Hanny opened her eyes and found herself in a soft bed, in an unfamiliar room. At the same time, at the other end of the bed, Oswald was stretching placidly, since he had also just woken up. The princess asked him and discovered they were in his father's chambers. Suddenly, Hanny noticed that the boy's eyes were very swollen. Oswald only smiled because the little one's eyes weren't much better. There was a brief pause in the air, and then the protagonists let out an unrestrained laughter. The girl felt as if she had just woken up after a long winter. Outside, new shoots were blooming, symbolizing the arrival of the long-awaited spring. Meanwhile, in the dungeon, a guard was trying to silence the maids accused of helping Eleonora. They believed themselves innocent, thinking they were only following their lady's orders. One of them, crying, was prepared to recount in detail everything that had happened. Next to the guard was Frederick, who looked with displeasure towards the distant cell. There was Her Highness, the former Empress Eleonora, sitting in silence with her head bowed. All the maids spoke of her cruelty, so the emperor wanted to hear the woman's own version. But she said nothing. She only occasionally looked at Frederick with manic eyes. The news about Eleonora's abuse spread like wildfire throughout the palace and beyond. Frederick knew that, being the former empress, she would still be the center of everyone's attention. However, it would take a weighty reason to strip her of her title and punish her as she deserved. But what worried the emperor most was how Hanny would react to all this. So he invited the girl to his study, and she arrived accompanied by Oswald. Looking closely at the girl, Frederick wanted to tell her something important. Crossing his hands, the emperor confessed that he planned to sentence Eleonora to the death penalty. The girl was surprised to hear the same sentence her mother received in her past life. On that occasion, the woman unsuccessfully tried to poison the emperor's mother, Constance. When that happened, they locked up Eleonora and her daughter in a separate palace, where they lived all that time. However, afterwards the woman also tried to poison Melissa, and this time she succeeded, so she was sentenced to death. And her daughter Hanny was locked up in an icy palace on the snowy mountain, where she spent the rest of her life. Now, Eleonora's punishment was just as severe as before, but this time because of the girl. Seeing her look, Frederick hurried to clarify that the little one had no fault in all this. Furthermore, her mother had already tried to poison Constance, so it was time for her to pay for her actions. The protagonist understood that the emperor was worried about her, fearing that she would blame herself for her mother's death. But Hanny had prepared for this since she arrived here, and felt no guilt. So, looking confidently at His Highness, she confessed that she was perfectly fine. Frederick was surprised by such a determined response, and a look so unusual in a child. Then, he also confessed that the woman had lost her status, and that the execution would be in 2 days. At that moment, the little girl became curious to know if her mother admitted to treating her badly. It turned out that Eleonora denied everything and considered herself completely innocent. The maids were also unmasked, who accused each other trying to save themselves. They too would receive a severe punishment. And hearing this, Hanny decided to obey His Majesty's orders. Making a bow, she thanked the emperor profusely for saving her. Then Frederick ordered her to raise her head, since he only did what he should have done a long time ago. It surprised him that, although she and Oswald were the same age, the girl seemed much more mature. Thinking about it, he remembered that his son still calls the protagonist by her name, even though they were the same age. Hanny was Frederick's sister, so Oswald should call her aunt. However, the boy disagreed. He wanted them to call each other by name. The father did not object, but he wanted the boy to ask permission from the princess herself. Looking at her with bright eyes, he hoped His Highness would not deny him permission. It turned out that almost no one called him by his name. Everyone called him Crown Prince. Only a select few could call him by name. And Hanny was one of them. That's why Oswald expected her to agree, squinting because of the light radiating from the boy. The protagonist decided she could afford anything. Hearing his consent and seeing his son's happy face, Frederick burst out laughing, unable to contain his emotions. Oswald threw himself onto the girl and enveloped her in a warm hug. 2 days later, the day of the execution finally arrived. And at that moment, the children were in the room reading books. According to Charles, His Highness ordered the protagonists forbidden from leaving the palace until everything was over. Of course, a responsible adult would not let children witness something so gruesome. So, although it saddened her, the protagonist understood that it was the right thing to do. But suddenly, Oswald slammed his book shut and suggested Hanny follow him. His face showed a desire to see the woman's execution. And although they couldn't get close to the execution site, the young crown prince knew a shortcut, extending his hand towards the girl. The protagonist hoped she could trust him. Deciding to think about the consequences later, Hanny accepted and held out her hand in response. Carefully opening the door, the children slipped out stealthily and headed towards the exit unseen. Suddenly, behind them, the voice of a man was heard. Surprised to see them there, it was the captain of the knights, Drake, who was also the emperor's right-hand man. However, it turned out that Oswald knew perfectly well that the captain would be there without fail. And now the boy wanted Drake to personally escort them to the palace gates. Of course, the captain refused. But it wasn't a request without something in return. Because the crown prince knew that, half a year ago, Drake broke his father's favorite vase. But everyone thought it was Melissa. And hearing this, the captain was horrified. The boy found out about this in a conversation between him and the empress when he happened to pass by. Oswald's mother had made that vase with her own hands, as a gift for her husband. And even his right-hand man wouldn't be forgiven for something like that. And Drake even tried to hide behind the empress, which left the captain even more disconcerted. After that, the captain of the knights looked at the children with a pleading gaze. The girl also made that face, desiring to watch the execution from afar. And silently, the young captain was surprised by how desperately the young princess was pleading. A little later, the palace maids, who were in the courtyard, heard footsteps behind them, and they turned around. They were surprised to see Drake carrying the children in his arms, knowing they were forbidden from leaving the palace. Oswald thanked him, promising in return to keep his secret no matter what. Around the same time, the second squadron of knights was escorting the criminals towards the scaffold. Suddenly, the heroes heard the emperor's voice, who didn't understand what they were doing there. He perfectly remembered giving the order not to let the children out, so he expected an explanation from the captain. Drake, paralyzed, started sweating and tried to say something insecurely. At that very moment, the second division began to salute the empress's son, His Majesty Frederica. Eleonora was surprised to hear the emperor was near and looked towards him. Suddenly, she saw her daughter, who was calm and watching the woman. Scared, Frederick quickly covered the little girl, leaving her confused. At that instant, insults came out of Eleonora's mouth, and curses directed at the girl. The woman didn't believe the royal family could love her after she betrayed her own mother. Now Eleonora was sure she should have gotten rid of that ungrateful monster from the start. Hearing the threats and offenses, the protagonist realized that those words no longer scared her. Seeing her mother broken and miserable, Haney couldn't believe she had suffered so much because of her fault. Precisely that reaction from the woman was the reason why the emperor didn't want them to meet. He immediately ordered the soldiers to continue the march towards the scaffold and take that wretch out of his sight. However, Eleonora suddenly collapsed to the ground, leaving the knights in shock. She bit one of the soldiers' hands and demanded to be released immediately. The other knights dragged her away by force. Listening to her endless insults towards Haney, the woman cursed her daughter, thinking that one day they would also get rid of her like trash. And she was glad that Haney would witness the pursuit, because according to Eleonora, the girl awaited the same fate. At that moment, Drake covered her mouth with a rag, leaving everyone surprised. He didn't understand how the soldiers could forget how to silence hysterical criminals. Holding Haney's hand, Oswald wanted her not to take her mother's words seriously. The girl looked surprised at the crown prince, confused and not knowing what to say. But gathering courage, she firmly declared that the woman's words would no longer affect her. Eleonora looked at the girl surprised, who said goodbye to her in a calm voice. Annie stayed there until her mother crossed the main door and disappeared from sight. As her mother's figure became smaller with every step, the protagonist's emotions also faded. Frederick thought that the Second Templar needed to train again, and Drake offered to tell him. However, according to the Emperor, the captain was no exception either, and he accepted it resignedly. Annie was worried about him, but Oswald remained calm, knowing his father's indulgence towards Drake. Then the Emperor reminded them that this was not the time to worry about others. He also wanted to hear excuses from the children who had disobeyed the order. Hearing that they had to prepare, Annie immediately closed her eyes, thinking they were going to hit her. But Frederick approached, gently ruffled her hair, and then moved away. After sending the children with Drake to the palace, the Emperor headed for the door. On the way to the execution, Annie watched him walk away for a while, rubbing the part of her head that he had stroked. Upon returning to the palace, the children began to devour sweets, and Oswald offered the protagonist a cookie. Annie still couldn't believe that all of this was really happening to her, even thinking that she had come back from the dead, and that everything was going so well seemed strange to her. Lost in her thoughts, she didn't notice when Oswald carefully took her hand. Coming out of her trance, Hanny looked at the crown prince, hoping everything would be worth it. Seeing the protagonist's distant gaze, the boy decided to find out what was bothering her. It turned out that she simply wasn't entirely sure that all of this wasn't a dream. That's why Hanny didn't want to bother Oswald, thinking she just had to get used to it. Then, with a determined look, the crown prince thought the girl must remember something important, and that was that they were a family. And Oswald loved the protagonist very much. Hanny was surprised that the boy called her family, but he was very sure of his words, so she had nothing to worry about, because all her fears would never come true. Not being sure she deserved that treatment, the little one decided to ask if he truly considered her part of his family. That question made Oswald laugh, because for him, they had always been family, since they were born. However, seeing her reaction, the protagonist thought perhaps that made Hanny sad. But it was the opposite, and the protagonist felt truly happy for what he said. Suddenly, Charles entered through the door, greeting the children and hoping they had rested well. The butler hoped to borrow Sir Drake for a moment because he wanted to talk to him about something. Hearing whispers behind the door, the children thought they would probably talk about the execution. A short while later, Drake finally returned to them. with a very confused expression on his face. It turned out that the execution ceremony had ended, and His Majesty would soon return to the palace. From his face, the protagonist understood that the captain was hiding something, but she decided not to ask. However, she decided to apologize to Sir Drake for the trouble. Smiling and kneeling down, the captain sincerely asked her to always call him by name. Furthermore, there was no need to apologize, because the treatment had been fair, and now they had to keep their secret. Smiling from ear to ear, the girl promised that she wouldn't even insinuate anything about his secret. When the emperor returns, the captain will go carry sandbags at the training ground. As for the children, they would have to face Frederick's anger. But Oswald decided to protect Haney. However, the protagonist didn't want that, thinking she should take responsibility along with the others. Then, seeing her determination, the crown prince decided to propose something to the girl that might help. Drake watched in amazement as the two children whispered seriously about something. The protagonist was shocked by what she heard, but Oswald believed only she could achieve it. And if they did everything as he said, the father couldn't scold or punish them too severely. However, Hanny didn't see much point in that, biting her lip nervously. Just then, a maid entered and invited the children to an audience with the king. The protagonist stood paralyzed by how fast events were unfolding. The emperor was waiting for them in his study, looking at those entering with an intimidating expression. He expected Oswald and Haney, at least, to try to apologize for disobeying the order. The atmosphere was so tense that, swallowing, the girl stepped forward. The first thing she did was confess that she only wanted to see her mother one last time. With her own eyes, Hanny thought that only then could she truly realize that she had finally been freed from cruelty and mistreatment. Now the moment Oswald spoke of had arrived, and the crown prince signaled her to act. Clasping her hands and opening her eyes wide, the girl thought, is the emperor going to punish her? The atmosphere was so filled with tension that the protagonist couldn't even move. Because of Frederick's severe expression, it was clear that the plan had failed spectacularly. But suddenly, the emperor decided not to scold the children, which filled them with joy. Instead, he decided to punish the girl, starting to extend his hand towards her. Seeing that and hearing his words, Hanny's was horrified and froze again, huddled and with her eyes closed. The protagonist trembled with fear, awaiting a cruel punishment. The emperor ruffled her hair again, placing his hand on her head and leaving her confused. The punishment was that Frederick would now stroke her head without warning. The emperor also hoped that the little one would soon get used to it. As it was getting dark outside, he decided to let the children go, which made Oswald honey and Drake excited at the same time. However, Frederick was only referring to the children, because the captain had to stay a little longer. After all, didn't they have something to talk about? For example, when did Drake become so bold? The captain pretended everything was fine and acted that way in front of Honey. But in reality, it wasn't like that. He held the position of commander of the knights, so he looked older and tired. So at that moment, what he wanted least was to go to the training ground. So he decided to use Haney's method, putting on a tender face. But for some reason, it didn't work. That angered the emperor because Drake was already an adult, and he should have a conscience. So Frederick ordered him to take the sandbags and return to the training ground. The news of Eleonora's death plunged the entire palace into chaos, and Haney was glad to find out so soon. It was no wonder Sir Drake returned that day with a strange expression, since the people killed her before the execution, stoning her. Her end was not much different from that of her previous life, when the people rebelled against her for trying to poison Constance. She was a generous empress who cared for her people even after her husband's death. Now, the situation was completely different from the past life, since Haney revealed the abuse before the assassination attempt on Melissa. Society really had compassion for her. The little girl knew that everything would end the moment everyone discovered her ice powers. As long as the fear of magic remained in people's minds, she wouldn't be able to escape this unscathed. However, her new room was full of new things, which demonstrated the imperial family's sincere care for her. The protagonist was intrigued as to whether she had already gotten used to having a family. With these people who were always by her side, she regained hope, even if it was in vain. That's why she felt guilty about hiding her abilities from everyone, even though Frederick gave her a music box and secretly maintained the ice castle where she lived. Annie decided to tell the truth, hoping to receive help in return, or face the consequences. But that no longer mattered, and the girl was ready to accept any outcome. The next morning, she was calmly having breakfast with Oswald in the imperial dining room. Annie thought that, in the end, as emperor, Frederick could even have his powers serve him. But the protagonist had no idea how to show that she could be useful. Seeing the girl's serious face, Oswald became curious to know what was wrong with her. She smiled at him, surprised by the boy's ability to notice every detail. After breakfast, the crown prince left for classes, promising to see the princess later. Waving goodbye, the protagonist decided it wasn't time to waste time. While Oswald studied, she also had to find her own way to learn. Suddenly, she heard the servants' voices talking about the arrival of spring. That meant that, for a while, they wouldn't be able to enjoy the ice shavings. With their salaries, they couldn't even dream of that in the warm season, unless the imperial family invited them. Viola, who accompanied the little one, was surprised to see that she suddenly stopped dead in her tracks. But the girl finally saw the opportunity she had been looking for all this time. That same day, she left the servants very confused with her unexpected decision. The girls immediately thought that perhaps they had done something wrong with her. One of the maids tried to explain to her that, if the young lady had any inconvenience, she could always turn to them. However, the girl insisted that she wanted to bathe alone. In the end, the protagonist managed to convince the servants that she was no longer that small. And thus she got what she wanted. The maids decided to wait for the princess outside, in case she needed anything. Finally alone, Hanny stood in the middle of the bath and prepared herself. Concentrating, she began to move her arms, releasing icy energy. Casting the spell, she created an ice crystal in the air, from which an intense cold emanated. The girl realized that her abilities were still at the same level as in her past life. And this time, it would be better to show her powers immediately and prove that they were useful. However, due to her young age, she could not handle magic as delicately as before. The protagonist would have to visit His Majesty after recovering her abilities. Even so, she was happy to recall the sensation of using her powers. After that, she bathed and calmly went out with the maids who were waiting for her by the door. While drying the princess with towels, the girls thought it was adorable that she wanted to bathe alone. But even after 10 days, her decision remained the same, leaving the girls bewildered. Throughout that time, Hanny went to bathe alone every time. The maids thought that, probably, the girl simply didn't want to show anyone the wounds on her body. They were sure that Her Highness needed time to recover from her terrible past. So, each time they waited patiently behind the door, while the little one practiced ice magic. On the 10th day, she already controlled the ice with ease, mastering it completely. Now everything was ready, and all that remained was to inform the emperor. In her mind, she hoped Frederick would put his hand on her head again and mess up her hair a little. But Hanny also knew that, if something went wrong, she would have to use her powers to escape, because the princess had already firmly decided that she would never return to the snowy mountains. After a while, she finally arrived at the emperor's palace, guarded by Drake and his team. The captain was very surprised to see the girl walking alone, and so calm. By smiling at her, he immediately understood that the princess had come to visit His Highness. However, it turned out that she also had something very important to communicate to the emperor. Suddenly, Haney noticed the gaze of one of the knights guarding the entrance. When she tried to smile at him, the knight made such a strange face that it left her completely bewildered. Impacted by what she saw, Haney thought that His Highness must be busy and couldn't receive her. But Drake was sure that he didn't have that many pending matters. So he ordered Scott to inform Frederick of the princess's arrival. Scott turned out to be the same knight who smiled at the girl. And she didn't understand what had scared her so much. Finally, upon arriving in front of the Emperor's study door, the protagonist hesitated a little, and then knocked awkwardly. Upon receiving permission to enter, she opened the door determinedly and saw Frederick sitting amidst piles of papers. Remembering Drake's words, and seeing the huge stack of documents on Frederick's desk, the girl thought about coming back another time. However, the Emperor thought she had nothing to worry about, because he could finish that work very quickly. And no matter how busy he was, Frederick simply couldn't refuse his younger sister when she came to see him. First of all, he invited her to sit at the table, where there were various sweets and a teapot with tea. The Emperor was eager to hear what his little sister wanted to tell him. But suddenly, the girl got up from the table and fell to her knees, bowing deeply before Frederick. Her request was for His Highness to allow her to stay in the imperial palace. Surprised by her request, Frederick thought that in that case, she had no reason to ask. It was completely natural for her to be allowed to stay there, since the Emperor was the girl's older brother. But Hania understood that, until now, she hadn't told His Highness an important thing. And when he heard it, he might change his mind about her. Gathering courage, the princess confessed that she had the power to freeze with ice. For a moment, the Emperor stood still, looking silently at the girl. Annie didn't know if it was time to start running away, or if she should wait a little longer. Now, Frederick understood why her words hadn't calmed the protagonist. He became curious to know if Eleonora knew about her ability, to which he received a negative answer. Because at that moment, only 2 people knew about Annie's power. And both were there. The protagonist knew she could hide it forever, but she didn't want to repay the favor the Emperor had done her like that. Frederick was completely calm and, moreover, willing to help his sister. The girl looked at him surprised, not understanding why he accepted so easily. For his part, Frederick also didn't understand why the protagonist had an expression full of distrust. He knew that for someone with a power that terrified the entire empire, it was dangerous to stay in the imperial palace. However, Frederick had already realized that Hanny was not one of those children who abused their abilities. Because if the girl had wanted to, that would have happened long ago, and Eleonora would have been the first to suffer. And then surely the maids. But it was Hanny who appeared full of scars from constant beatings. The Emperor understood that he could never forget that incident. So, trusting the girl, he hoped his decision was not a mistake. After that, he sat next to the princess with a smile and held out his hand to her. Although the girl had prepared for the worst, she was very glad that the Emperor believed her, remembering that in these cases she should give thanks. Hanny thanked His Highness from the bottom of her heart. Frederick was also grateful to the little girl for her incredible bravery. Then he ruffled her hair, which made her very happy. The Emperor discovered that the girl now had complete control over her powers. She understood that the best thing was to show it. But she had to choose a place where it wouldn't matter if traces of water were left. So, Frederick suggested going to the bathroom, which was right next to that study. Annie was surprised, not imagining how busy he must be to have a private bathroom in his office. Upon arrival, the girl stepped aside and prepared to start. She took a deep breath, concentrating the magic in her hands, and she created ice crystals. Then she made the blocks rise, while Frederick calmly watched what happened. Before his eyes, Hanny began to shape the ice, from geometric shapes to Oswald's head. Of course, the Emperor had already heard from her about her good control of the ability. But the result exceeded all expectations. At the same time, he understood that eternal secrets do not exist in this world. Therefore, Frederick wanted to propose using those abilities for good. And Haney even had an idea about it. She thought they could create ice, and then sell it, using the profits to help those who needed it. The emperor knew that the main problem with the ice business was the lack of means to preserve it. But if Haney used her magic well, the ice would practically not be damaged. The supply would become constant. People's lives would improve. And then, even if they discovered the girl's magic, no one would judge her. Upon receiving approval for her idea, the protagonist became very excited. Upon learning that the money remaining after helping people, she planned to give it to the emperor. Frederick was speechless. Unable to contain himself, he burst out laughing, thinking that his little sister had no reason to try to pay him back, at least because she was still at that age where it is natural to simply receive. The emperor decided that the remaining money would stay with her, but he hoped the girl would donate something to charity. He believed that the good deeds Hanny performed would one day become the strength that would protect her. At that moment, the girl decided to say goodbye, saying goodbye to His Highness. Suddenly, a shining bracelet fell from the little one's dress, leaving Frederick in shock, realizing that he had noticed it, and was picking up the bracelet. The protagonist got very scared. The bracelet was quite simple, and the emperor didn't understand why she carried it in her pocket, and not on her wrist. Suddenly, she realized it was her money, saved in case she had to escape. Annie had to confess that she planned to run away if something went wrong, and the bracelet was for selling in that case. The girl dared not look at His Highness, who suddenly started laughing hysterically. Frederick burst out laughing upon seeing that. Among all the jewels in her room, Hanny chose that very simple bracelet. Noticing that the protagonist turned red as a tomato, he laughed even harder. When he managed to calm down, he understood the girl and promised her he would stop bothering her. Now she could return calmly to her room, especially because Oswald surely had already lost sight of her. Making a farewell bow, Hanny thanked His Highness from the bottom of her heart for his kindness. As he watched the little one leave through the door, Frederick remembered a person. Just as the emperor thought, that man was perfect for that job. Upon going out to the street, the protagonist was very happy that everything had ended so well. Suddenly, Scott called her. He approached the princess and bowed to her. Upon introducing himself, he stated his name and that he was a member of the Order of Knights. Annie immediately recognized him by his unforgettable smile. That gave her goosebumps. Scott thought that the previous time his behavior might have been quite offensive. He felt like the girl looked worried, so he tried to help her, but it seems he went too far. So now, Scott apologized to His Majesty for his attitude. Falling flat on the ground, he was prepared to accept any punishment the princess considered fair. Annie tried to calm him down, understanding that the knight only acted that way out of concern for her. But Scott refused to accept so much kindness, because that's how relationships between a master and his knight should be. At least that's what the captain always taught him. And right at that moment Drake arrived, ordering Scott to be quiet. The captain apologized to the protagonist for his behavior. Then, Hanny quickly explained that the noble knight only approached because he was worried. In that case, Drake was glad to introduce the knight who, despite his youth, had become the second strongest in the order. Smiling, Haney and Scott promised to look out for each other. The knight found it a bit awkward that the captain praised his abilities so much. He decided to strive even harder and become a good warrior for His Majesty. Seeing them, the girl dreamed that everyone would treat her with the same kindness. Frederick had a half-brother, Christopher, who completely refused the title of Archduke and ended up being Duke. There was no one better to produce ice, since he owned the Herne Mountains. After a while, the emperor invited the little one to introduce her to Christopher. Last time, Hanny didn't try the pastries, but this time she couldn't resist, and they turned out to be delicious. The Duke was truly perfect for that business, but the problem was whether he would accept Hanny. Of all the members of the imperial family, he was the one who hated Eleonora the most, and therefore also her daughter. Suddenly, the door burst open, and Christopher appeared in the doorway. However, the Duke's disheveled appearance greatly disconcerted the protagonist. In Hanny's memories, he was always an impeccable man. Elegant, wearing glasses, and a very formal tuxedo. Because he wasn't wearing glasses, he didn't even see the little girl. And walked right past her. With a resigned sigh. Collapsing onto the sofa next to his brother. Christopher was glad to finally rest. Frederick considered it a brave act. But his brother had already traveled 4 days without stopping by order of the emperor. The Duke was bewildered, not understanding why such urgency. It turned out that a good investment opportunity had arisen. And Frederick wanted his brother back in the business. Seeing Christopher's astonished gaze, the emperor clarified that it was about the ice business. The Duke was surprised to think that new technologies for preserving ice had emerged during his absence. However, although Frederick guaranteed success, Christopher didn't understand why the rush. So Hanny couldn't take it anymore, and explained that the new method. The emperor referred to her abilities. Hearing an unfamiliar voice, the Duke became alert and started taking out his glasses. Looking through the lens, he saw Hanny sitting in front of him. Eleonora's daughter. Filled with fury, he didn't understand what abilities they were talking about or why that girl was there. Frederick introduced her as his brother's future partner, hoping the girl would show her abilities. Since Hanny's power to create ice was quite dangerous, the emperor wanted to give her a slightly different role. Hearing about some power again, Christopher was completely confused. Frederick wanted his little sister to maintain the temperature and the integrity of the ice for a long time. Upon receiving the order to act, the princess began to concentrate magic in her hand. Then, before the Duke's eyes, who was in shock, she created several ice spheres in the air. She gathered them on a saucer and immediately offered them to the emperor. It was condensed, cold air, which could help the production machine keep the ice frozen longer. Christopher was stunned to see that, realizing that it was truly the power of ice. And he couldn't help but admit that, with that ability, the ice business was destined for success. However, the Duke did not want anything to do with that woman's daughter. So the emperor decided to tell him the latest news. The girl didn't want Frederick to insist so much if the Duke really didn't want to. But the emperor still decided to try, knowing that the fun would begin soon. First of all, he explained to his brother that this woman had been dead for a long time. After that, he told Christopher in detail everything that had happened. And about Hanny. Upon hearing the story, Christopher slammed his fist on the table so hard that all the cups and plates of cakes fell to the floor, crying with rage and indignation. He didn't understand how much longer this was going to continue. The protagonist had heard that the Duke was a cold person, who wouldn't even blink if someone died in front of him. But seeing him cry uncontrollably, the girl understood once again that one cannot believe rumors, although he looked quite stern. According to the emperor, Frederick was full of compassion. When he finished crying, Christopher took the contract from his brother's outstretched hand. Seeing the cups and saucers scattered on the floor, the protagonist was glad that nothing had broken. Only then did she understand the reason for the emperor's reaction to the bracelet. That it was surely cheaper than that dinnerware. After carefully reviewing all points, Christopher concluded that everything seemed fine to him. Then, Frederick asked him to vacate one of the palaces in a couple of days, which surprised the Duke. However, the emperor planned to give it to Princess Hanny, since she still didn't have her own palace. The girl thought that wasn't necessary, because she could live in the old palace. But Christopher insisted because, moreover, according to the contract, he would have to visit the protagonist every time. So the girl agreed, which made the Duke a little uncomfortable. Since the problem was solved, the emperor now planned to get rid of the things from the girl's old palace. Annie agreed, wanting to keep only one thing from everything that was there. Upon receiving permission, she immediately ran off to look for that thing in the palace. As punishment for her daring behavior, Frederick sent his brother after the girl to help her carry things. Christopher accepted and left, seeing the protagonist by the fountain. The girl walked along the road towards the entrance, and the Duke followed her. During the entire journey, they didn't say a single word to each other. And the girl didn't even notice his presence. Upon arriving at the palace, where she used to live with her mother, Hanny stopped for a moment. Christopher watched the castle surroundings with interest, where he hadn't been in about 10 years. Upon entering, the protagonist went straight to the door leading to her old room. A real chaos reigned inside, with broken objects everywhere. Seeing the mess in the room, Christopher wondered if it was possible to find anything there. But suddenly, the girl started picking up a broken music box from the floor, leaving the Duke in shock. Before, he had been very indignant about Frederick's decision to give that object to that woman's daughter. But the Emperor simply wanted to give a gift to his sister, who was the same age as Oswald. And now, the protagonist carefully picked up the remains of the box from the floor, looking at them sadly, unable to contain his emotions any longer. Christopher burst into tears again, revealing his presence to Hanny. She was very surprised that the Duke had also decided to come here. The protagonist confessed that he came at his brother's request, and that he was intrigued by the princess's valuable object. Seeing that the box was broken, he thought it was dangerous for a little girl. But the girl firmly decided not to throw it away, even though the Duke planned to keep the box. Surprised by that request, the protagonist slowly approached and reluctantly handed him the box. The return trip to the palace proceeded in the same silence. Suddenly, Christopher stopped and addressed the young princess, leaving her bewildered. The Duke confessed that all this time, he sincerely hated the little one for being Eleonora's daughter. He couldn't think of anything good, knowing that woman's true nature. But then he understood everything the girl had been through. Christopher only believed what he saw. And in the end, he ended up hating innocent people. And the protagonist knew it was too late for that. But he dared anyway. Making a bow, he apologized for judging Hanny up to that point. He truly regretted all the pain he caused her with his attitude. Of course, he didn't dare ask for her apology to be accepted immediately. But Christopher wanted to prove his sincerity with actions and earn the right to be forgiven. Seeing his honesty, the protagonist also decided not to remain silent and say everything. She knew the reasons for his hatred, and she thought that, although it hurt her, she couldn't do anything about it. It was very unfair because no one chooses where they are born. Even so, Hanny was sincerely grateful that the protagonist was the first to apologize. She believed in his sincerity, so she accepted the apologies happily, leaving Christopher surprised. But the princess had no doubts because he himself had promised to prove it with actions. That's why the protagonist expected the Duke to simply keep his word. Seeing her innocent smile, Christopher began to hit his face, feeling like a real good-for-nothing. Annie tried to stop him, as she had a cut on her hand from a broken box, and they had to hurry. Agreeing with her, the Duke wrapped his arms around the girl's waist. He lifted her up and began to walk back calmly. Confused, the protagonist became even more convinced that she should not believe rumors. Meanwhile, in Christopher's palace, an atmosphere of bustle reigned, and daily life. A short while later, the Duke entered through the main door, still carrying the girl in his arms. Seeing him, one of the servants, named Mabrelio, was surprised that the master had returned so soon from the emperor. The maids were also happy about the master's arrival, and were curious to know how the meeting with His Highness went. Suddenly, they saw a little girl whom Christopher was carrying under his arm. The girls and the servant were shocked to see him carrying the princess as if she were an object. They understood that the poor girl must surely be uncomfortable and, furthermore, probably didn't dare say anything in front of the gloomy master. But Christopher thought everything would be fine, since he had carried Oswald like this before. And he never complained, realizing that Hanny could actually be in pain. He apologized to the girl for the trouble. The maids also started apologizing to the little one, thinking it must be difficult to endure the Duke's rudeness. But the princess started defending the hero, thanks to whom she had arrived there so quickly. Taking a candy out of his pocket, One of the maids offered it to her with a smile, wanting to invite the girl. It was an artisanal candy from a famous pastry shop, with an extraordinary flavor. At that moment, the protagonist felt a strange unease inside, not understanding the reason. After the girl gratefully accepted the sweet, the maid introduced herself as Gerda. Suddenly, Gerda and the others saw a cut on Hanny's arm, and they were horrified. Noticing the confused looks, the Duke explained that the protagonist had cut herself on a broken box. The servants were very glad that their fears about the master were not confirmed. Christopher ordered that the palace doctor be sent for immediately. While waiting for the doctor, the hero decided to take the young princess to the living room. Gerda and Mabrelio received the order to follow them, while the other servants could take care of their duties. The employees were surprised, wondering if the master hadn't kicked them out too abruptly. With a wave of his hand, the Duke ordered snacks to be brought for him, and the girl to the lounge. Following Christopher, Jennifer, Hanny turned around in a moment and waved goodbye to the girls who were staying behind. The maids were moved by so much tenderness. Without hiding their feelings, they were surprised that, although she resembled Eleonora, the atmosphere around the girl was completely different. And since the master had brought her personally, they wanted to do their best for the little one. A few minutes later, the royal doctor arrived at the lounge where the protagonists were. Annie expected to see Agnes, but instead, a serious man with a briefcase entered. His name was August, and his presence made the protagonist nervous. After examining her, he concluded that the princess only needed to lower her fever a little. August was indignant, not understanding why a doctor as talented as him had to waste time in this place. He had personally treated the emperor, and now he had to take care of a poor princess, without contacts even. While saying all this out loud, suddenly his gaze fell upon the Duke, whom he recognized instantly. Then the doctor immediately changed his attitude, starting to flatter and praise the hero. August thought it wasn't worth wasting time on a useless girl, and that it was better to check on the Duke first. He immediately noticed a small cut on Christopher's cheek, and wanted to treat it without delay. As for the little one, according to the doctor, her wounds could wait a little. Stunned by what they heard, the servants concluded that they had just lost a staff doctor. They only hoped that the master wouldn't get too angry, because it could scare Hanny. Christopher gave an order, and two servants headed towards August, who stood paralyzed. They rushed over and in an instant reduced the frightened doctor to the floor. August didn't understand why the Duke suddenly decided to act this way towards him. Christopher was surprised that, for someone who ignored the princess, this was a surprise. The doctor tried to justify himself, since the hero himself had also considered the girl a nuisance not long ago. However, even if the Duke hated her, does that take away her royal title as princess? And how dare the doctor look down on a member of the royal family? But Christopher did not deny that in the past. He truly hated Hanny. And now, as August himself can see, everything has changed radically. That means the hero will no longer allow a nobody to ignore and belittle the princess. He intended to personally inform the emperor about this situation. While Augusto awaited his punishment, the servants dragged the man down the hall, from where his desperate cries could still be heard for a while. Gerda thought that, if she had known earlier, she would have simply asked for medicine to be brought. Annie was completely calm, since she had gotten used to this long ago. Christopher was horrified by her words, and looked at the girl with bewilderment. Sitting opposite, he no longer wanted to hear her say things like that. The Duke would always be willing to help her, so he hoped that, if something happened, Annie would come to him immediately. When he started treating her wounds, the hero suddenly noticed how thin the little one was. It turned out that now she was even plumper than before, which left Christopher confused. When the treatment was finished, Maverly became curious to know where the cut on the master's cheek came from. To the servant's surprise, the Duke had inflicted the wound on himself by hitting his face. He did it as punishment for being so rude to Haney. Then Maverly and Gerda remembered that before, the master had already done many things that deserved punishment. And now they were happy that he had matured and started thinking more rationally. Sighing, Christopher became curious to know how his attitude would change if the owner suddenly changed. Upon hearing about the change of owner, Maverly was shocked and opened his mouth in surprise. Then the protagonist was happy to introduce the new owner to them, pointing at Haney, something that had already been confirmed by the emperor. He hoped the servants would take care of her with the same dedication as they did him. Gerda and Maverly jumped for joy, because now the palace would be much more fun. When the day of the protagonist's move arrived, the servants in her old room were packing things and actively cleaning. According to Viola, August was discovered in corruption and sent to prison in the outskirts. He also dressed the princess, putting a spectacular dress with sparkles on her. While Hanny worried about how she would greet the new servants today, Oswald was by her side with an angry face. He thought the girl had no reason to move to another palace and leave him here alone. Annie thanked him for his words, but there was nothing more to be done. Moreover, the luggage was almost ready, so the boy made her promise that they would visit each other every day. The time to leave arrived, and Christopher entered to call the little one. Annie nodded, and Oswald expressed a great desire to go with them. However, the Duke knew that the boy had classes today, but he simply smiled silently. The protagonist didn't have the strength to resist, especially because if he simply forbade it, Annie would start consoling Oswald. Approaching the protagonist's new palace, Christopher's face filled with amazement. Smiling and putting his hands on his head, he thought that someone clearly doesn't know how to control themselves. Walking a little further, he covered the little one's eyes with his hand, who suddenly perceived the scent of something sweet. Approaching the entrance, the Duke wanted Hanny to look very closely ahead. When he removed his hand, he let the girl see a crowd of servants who had organized a party in honor of her arrival. The protagonist was shocked by the colorful decorations and the endless compliments she received. Passing through the corridor formed by the staff, joyful greetings were heard everywhere. Seeing Hanny's surprised face, Gerda thought it was still too early for the young lady to be amazed. With those words, even the always serious Duke felt quite uncomfortable. At that moment the palace chef appeared, who brought on a cart a 3-tiered cake made by himself. Oswald was deeply impressed by the elegance and beauty of that confectionery masterpiece. Unlike him, Haney looked at the huge cake with eyes full of fear and astonishment. Before, the protagonist had never had anything like that, and thought she didn't need it either. And now, her heart was beating in a completely different way than it did before. Smiling, Oswald thought that today Haney was the main protagonist, so she just had to enjoy it. Extending his hand, the girl understood that now she was truly not alone. She considered not only the cake beautiful, but everything they had prepared for her that day. Crying with happiness, Hanny thought it was as if today were her birthday. Hearing this, Maberly was also moved to tears, and Gerda thought that for them too it was the best day. Upon hearing the proposal to blow out the candles, the little one became nervous, since it was the first time she was doing it. At that moment, Christopher realized that no one had ever organized a party for her before. Therefore, the Duke decided to prepare well for the banquet in honor of her birthday. First of all, the protagonist shared the chef's special cake with everyone present. Seeing the atmosphere of this place and tasting the cake, Oswald decided that he could trust Hanny to them. Christopher was shocked, thinking it was strange to hear those words from a nephew to his aunt. The protagonist hoped the princess had no worries and could calmly enjoy that day. The girl nodded, thinking that she had liked everything very much, and that she was simply grateful. Annie also didn't understand why, but she really liked the people here, since Christopher had met them when he was her age. He could assure that they were trustworthy people. After thinking about it for a while, the Duke decided that he couldn't leave that broken music box. Hearing that he intended to fix it, the protagonist was very surprised, believing it was impossible. However, according to the Duke, the most skilled artisans in the empire worked there. Capable of achieving it, Annie stared intently at the protagonist, realizing that she could soon hear that beautiful melody from the box again. Oswald decided to stay for the night, and later they lay down together on opposite ends of the bed. Lying in bed, the girl remembered how they had given her that music box 2 years ago. The reason she had managed to survive until now was that Jenny had hidden it from her mother. But that time, the girl forgot to hide the box. And that's why the tragedy occurred. In some incredible way, everything could start anew. So it seemed there were no more reasons to be on guard. However, looking at Oswald asleep now, Haney decided never to let her guard down again. Approaching the boy and taking his hand, she decided to protect herself and her family. Unlike the protagonist's previous family, these people taught her completely new ways to show love. And the first one to make Haney feel that was precisely Oswald, determined to protect him until the end. The little one fell asleep, holding the boy's hand between hers. The next morning, delicate female hands gently touched Haney, trying to wake her up. Upon opening her eyes, the girl saw Viola's cheerful face in front of her, who smiled warmly at her. Annie was surprised, but it turned out that the maid could not leave without first greeting her lady. The reason Viola was not present yesterday was that she was handing over her responsibilities, which surprised the princess. The little one didn't understand how it was possible that the emperor's maid, with the highest rank after the butler, was working here. Viola decided to introduce herself again, announcing that from that day on she would be the princess's personal maid. At yesterday's celebration, the protagonist looked for the girl, not wanting to leave without saying goodbye to her. Annie, of course, thought it would be great to stay together. However, it seemed strange to her that His Majesty's maid had to attend to a common princess. But Viola replied that she considered this place the best to work. Moved by the protagonist's confused expression, the girl saw how a sleepy Oswald appeared behind the little one. The level of tenderness became critical, and the girl could barely contain her desire to hug them all. Instead, she remembered how a few months ago she was the first to see Haney's wounds. Viola's heart trembled knowing that the girl endured everything in silence, without making a single sound. She started to worry seeing how the girl shrank, and observed everything around her. And after several days, Haney smiled shyly, and thanked her for the first time. Only then did Viola truly understand how good the princess was. At that moment, the maid wanted to know her mistress even better, and decided to stay with her. Holding back tears, the protagonist wished that Viola would always be by her side from now on. When Oswald finished waking up and heard the conversation, he threw himself on them with loving hugs. The maid remembered that she had woken the girl up because Empress Melissa would arrive soon. The reason for her visit was to order clothes made especially for Haney, and for that she would bring a tailor. The protagonist was confused and looked at Viola without understanding anything. It turned out that, besides Melissa and the tailor, Drake had also arrived. Christopher and His Highness Frederick. The Duke only overheard in passing that something was happening, and decided to come see. The Emperor had no important matters today, and the captain was just accompanying him. The Empress had always wanted to do this together if she ever had a daughter, but she didn't think it would happen like this. The protagonist was sure that last time they had already bought her enough clothes, but Melissa didn't think so. Moreover, the Empress wanted to give the princess a good welcome gift to her new home. However, because of the number of dresses, Honey thought they had brought more than an entire store. Frederick was surprised that his wife wanted to try all those dresses on the little one, but the girl didn't see it as complicated. When the fitting started, the princess showed each dress to the three heroes, who couldn't decide which one suited her best. One of the dresses was made of a special silk, and was much softer than the others, since a girl would use it. The Empress paid special attention to comfort. When the fitting ended, the protagonist was exhausted. After trying on dozens of dresses, to her surprise, Melissa decided to buy all the clothes they had chosen for her. Realizing it was time to pay, Frederick, Christopher, and Drake took out their checks at the same time. But it turned out that the Empress had already paid for everything. Leaving the heroes in shock, she ordered them to sign the checks every time Hanny put on a new dress. Picking up the girl in her arms, the Empress wondered if the princess had a difficult day. Hanny didn't understand why she was so tired. If she had spent the whole day sitting in the same place. Oswald promised to come right after classes. And meanwhile, they took the protagonist to her room, where she fell asleep instantly. With time, in the protagonist's old palace, rumors about the wonderful life in her new home were heard everywhere. As devilish as Eleonora was, her daughter turned out to be the most adorable princess. Some thought that everyone now felt sorry for Hanny because she was a child. But what would happen when she grew up? The servants of the girl's palace were happy because, since she arrived, Christopher also started showing up more often. And right now, walking through the palace gardens, the protagonist suddenly saw the Duke. The girl immediately ran to greet him. But the hero thought running like that was dangerous. It turned out that she already knew he was coming. That's why she went there to meet him as soon as possible. Looking closely at her dress, Christopher suddenly started taking off his cloak, wrapping the girl in it. He understood that it was cold, and that with those clothes she could easily catch a cold. The protagonist tried to justify herself, saying that due to her strength, she couldn't feel the cold. But the Duke didn't want to hear anything. After that, with complete calmness, he picked her up and headed to the palace. Upon arriving with Frederick, he and the Emperor started arguing about the little one's hairstyle. The Duke was surprised by how badly his brother knew how to choose the right style. The main objective of their meeting was to prepare to start the ice business. The project will be carried out in the name of Peak. So now they had to conquer the market in every region. The technical problems that Hanny solved, thanks to her ability, could no longer be hidden. Hearing that they would have to publish a statement, the Emperor was bewildered. The Duke wanted to announce to everyone that they had found a solution to the storage problem. But it was completely confidential. Right at that moment, he finished styling the girl's hair, carefully arranging the hair. After that, he handed Frederick all the documents regarding the equipment, logistics, and also the budget plan. Seeing them, Honey had the impression that the heroes felt neither fear nor rejection towards her power. They were surprised, thinking maybe she wanted them to be afraid. Upon hearing this, the protagonist immediately shook her head, because that wasn't what she meant. The heroes were completely calm and saw no reason to be frightened. However, Frederick admitted that there was a moment when he was scared just because the girl had magical powers. And since the conversation was going that way, he also confessed that Oswald had abilities. Hearing that, Hanny was shocked for a few seconds, absorbing the information. Snapping out of her trance, she exclaimed in surprise, looking at the Emperor with bewilderment. Then Frederick approached and stroked the girl's head, trying to calm her down a bit. At first, the Emperor thought it was coincidence how perceptive the boy could be. But over time, it became clear that the Crown Prince had something akin to clairvoyance. It was the power of the God of Light, which left the protagonist confused again. From her past life, she already knew that this was the main god of the entire empire. It symbolized light and the sun. And he also had the gift of prophecy and vision. Although Oswald's power does not always manifest nor depend on his will, it has already been of great help. The protagonist also knew that not only the Crown Prince had this ability, but it was not yet time. Now she understood that it was not an illusion, and that the boy could really see her through everything. And who knows, maybe that day it wasn't a coincidence that he was in that hallway and saw how the maids took her away. That creature, whom Hanny was hurt by to death, generously gave his love to another person. But if it really was Oswald, then the boy called the Light was truly loved by the light. The protagonist became intrigued as to how many more people knew about the Crown Prince's abilities. It turned out that almost all members of the imperial family were aware, in addition to about 5 other people, including the high priest. So the girl wanted to know if she could now tell the boy about her own power. Frederick understood that this could bring trouble, and that it was better to wait a little. As he had said before, it would be safer if the fewest possible people knew about the princess's power. Understanding the depth of his concerns, Hanny apologized, thinking she had said something silly. Later, leaving the palace with the protagonist, Christopher noticed she was down. So, as if nothing had happened, he decided to clarify that soon the princess would have to start attending classes. The girl was very surprised. But the Duke understood that since she had gotten used to the palace, she could start studying. At that moment, she realized how perceptive the Duke was, because studying was Hanny's dearest dream. However, the little one was too cautious. That's why Christopher only noticed it recently. If she just stayed in envy, nothing in her life would change. And what the hero had said before about helping her were not just empty words. So the girl smiled sincerely and thanked Christopher for guessing her desire. After accompanying Hanny to the palace, the Duke returned to the Emperor, interrupting him at his work. There was real horror on the Duke's face, and surprise, so much so that Frederick was a little bewildered. The Emperor thought his brother had forgotten something, but it turned out that everything had to do with the princess. According to the Duke, they had to hire a teacher for her as soon as possible. The Duke told the Emperor about the recent conversation with the little one, saying that he wanted to comfort her. But Frederick thought it was still too soon for her to start studying, although he himself learned from childhood. However, upon learning that the girl had asked for it herself, Frederick immediately changed his mind. First of all, he wanted to know if there was someone for the teacher position. Christopher proposed 2 teachers, of whom the Emperor chose the most loyal one, Sir Harbard. Once the decision was made, Frederick personally sent him a letter asking him to come. Shortly after, the ice business grew day by day, and rumors started circulating. One day, Christopher overheard Oswald wondering if Hanny wasn't starting puberty. The protagonist was shocked by the surprise, and the Duke let out a little giggle, covering his mouth with his hand. Hanillo looked at him, expecting help, but the Duke could barely contain his laughter. It turned out that the boy had seen those words in a book and wanted to find out what they meant. It said there that teenagers try to bathe alone, just what the little one was doing while practicing magic. So, putting on a thoughtful face, Christopher suggested that perhaps it really was puberty. Seeing the girl's look, he started begging her to understand the joke. So the protagonist decided to explain to the crown prince that the princess just needed time to adapt to the new environment. That's why she behaved that way, and the boy nodded convinced. Oswald wasn't the type to be fooled so easily, but it seems Christopher managed it. Looking ahead, the Duke realized with horror that everyone had already arrived. The boy started rushing everyone, realizing they were already late. They were on their way to a family dinner, which would be the first in Princess Hanny's life. Upon entering the dining room, the Duke apologized for being a little late. He also offered separate apologies to Empress Mother Constance. In response, she smiled and suggested Princess Hanny sit next to her. Upon accepting, the little one realized that it was the first time she had seen His Majesty since arriving at the palace. Melissa was bewildered by Oswald's hairstyle that Christopher had given him. Since everyone was gathered, it was time to start, and soon the table was filled with culinary delights. Just seeing the dishes made the protagonist's head spin, and she felt ferocious hunger. Constance suggested that Hanny start the meal with the salmon, which was very soft. Putting a small piece of fish in her mouth, the princess's eyes shone with pleasure. The Empress was very glad that the little one appreciated the extraordinary flavor of the dish. Then she started offering her other delicacies, while the Duke watched them attentively. He was very surprised when his mother became so affectionate. When he and his brother were little, they didn't dream of anything like that because Mom thought they could do everything by themselves. Constance was surprised that an adult man could be envious of his younger sister. Frederick smiled, realizing that his brother wanted Mom's affection so much. And he didn't want to give it up to his sister. So, the emperor decided to take care of his brother himself and put a piece of salmon on his plate. Then he started stroking Christopher's head, telling him to chew many times. Frederick tried to maintain a serious expression, but he could barely hold back. The funniest thing was Christopher's face, which was in shock from everything that was happening. Unable to contain himself, the emperor and the others burst out laughing, seeing the hero's confused face. After eating the fish, he thought Frederick could have fun, but not go too far. A few minutes later, Constance remembered that the princess was looking for a teacher at that time. The empress felt a little sorry that the little one wanted to start studying so soon. Even so, she trusted that the protagonist could handle everything. Constance believed that in Haney's small hands there were a lot of possibilities, which would allow her to be whoever she wanted. That's why she wanted the girl not to listen to anyone, and to follow her heart and not to rush. Because everything had its time. Even after the family dinner. The girl remembered those words, looking at her hands with a smile. In general, she loved today's meeting. And she felt a little sorry that it had already ended. Both the moving day and now. The protagonist really liked the atmosphere when everyone gathered and spent time together. The Duke thought there was nothing to regret, because there were still many nights like that ahead. Moreover, when the princess saw what awaited her in the palace, she would be glad that everything had ended sooner than expected. It was something she had been eagerly awaiting, and after thinking about it for a while, Haney looked at the hero surprised. She thought fixing the music box would take a long time, but thanks to the natural charm and the generous wallet of the Duke, they reached an agreement. They immediately rushed to the palace, where Christopher handed the protagonist a small chest. Upon opening it, she saw a music box that had been completely restored. Happy memories began to flash before the little one's eyes, making her eyes shine. For several minutes, Hanny stared hypnotized at the gift, which until recently she hadn't even expected to have fixed. Taking it in her hands, the protagonist carefully examined the music box all around. The broken parts and the crystals had been replaced, and now it looked as if it were new. Putting on the music, the girl lay down next to it, with a sweet smile, truly enjoying life. A while later, when leaving class, she unexpectedly ran into Christopher. He greeted her back and found out that the teacher had been so active that the little one also had to work hard. Normally, Harvard was not so energetic, but it seems that, upon seeing the protagonist, he found motivation. It turns out that today the Duke left home for the first time in the last 3 days. To Hanny's surprise, the reason for the Duke's occupation turned out to be Oswald. The boy wanted to walk with the princess through the streets, so Christopher was looking for ways to occupy his time. However, now he was curious to know if the little one would agree to go for a walk. The girl's eyes shone with excitement, and she happily agreed, realizing that it would be the first time she went out of the palace. The walk was planned for the next day, since the Duke needed to recover a little. For now, they had to concentrate on work, and Hanny had to make about 20 condensed air particles. After so much training, she created the ice particles in the air with much more ease and elegance, gathering them in a small bag. She handed it to the Duke without problems. Christopher Lopez O'Hoffer thanked her and noticed that Hanny had become even more skilled at it. Perhaps the conversations about puberty influenced it, which made the little one lower her eyebrows ironically. Anyway, as always, she completed her task perfectly. The next day, disguised as commoners, the 3 heroes were preparing to go out. Oswald was fascinated that, even with that dress, Hanny still looked just as adorable. With those clothes, he felt like he was really going out, and his heart beat faster. Looking at the Duke, the girl was surprised to see a huge sword on his belt. It turned out that the hero didn't handle it very well, but he took it just in case. In any case, in this matter it was better to trust Christopher, since he only knew the basics. The father had told Oswald that his uncle was better at martial arts than fencing, Looking at the Duke, Haney understood that such a physique could only be achieved with a lot of training. Moreover, the previous emperor usurped the throne, which annoyed many rich people and turned them into political enemies. Therefore, surely the childhood of his two older children was not calm at all. After a while, the heroes finally arrived at the commercial street of the imperial capital. The heroine was impressed by the quantity of things, from products to people. The first thing Christopher did was tell the children that they should not go alone or follow strangers. He made them repeat all the rules until they knew them by heart. After a few minutes, the children were finally free and sighed in relief. Starting to walk down the street, the hero's eyes darted around. What surprised Haney the most was the variety of fruits in the street stalls. She also noticed the variety of fish and how they used the ice they produced. Compared to the palace, the atmosphere was completely different, and that made the girl very happy. Seeing a corn dog vendor, Oswald was curious to know what they were. Not having any idea, Christopher proposed that the children try them with the money he gave them. The vendor was happy to see such nice customers and told them the price, taking out their little bags and doing simple calculations. The heroes gathered the necessary amount, especially for the children. The woman chose the biggest corn dogs and appetizing ones with plenty of sauce. The children stared hypnotized at that unknown delicacy, from which an irresistible smell of meat emerged. The taste of that delicacy turned out to be incredibly delicious, filling every cell in the body with joy. After trying a few more types of street food, the children were surprised to discover that their money had disappeared. While still walking down the commercial street, one of the shops caught Haney's attention. It was jewelry, and among them something very special stood out. They were 3 bracelets with a profound name. Give your unbreakable heart to the one you love. Knowing that the children no longer had money, Christopher offered to pay himself. Oswald and Haney each put on a bracelet, looking at the ornament with satisfaction. The 3rd bracelet they gave to the Duke, who considered it a very touching gesture. Moving forward, the protagonist raised her head and suddenly froze in place. In the distance, above the houses and the forest, the gigantic and snowy Mount McLeod rose. It was the tallest mountain in the entire empire, visible from anywhere. An incredibly intense cold, right in the center of the country. It had instilled terror in the inhabitants of the empire for 500 years. Turning her head, Honey saw a kind fruit vendor smiling at the young buyer. The protagonist knew that if everyone discovered her abilities, no one would smile at her again. Meanwhile, the heroes slowly climbed to the top of Hirn, where the district's administrative building was located. A young man, focused on working at his desk, was surprised to see someone entering the building. Realizing it was the Duke, the boy got so scared that he started trembling. He didn't understand what had brought His Highness there, while Christopher was surprised by his reaction. The reason was that, on his last visit, the Duke had left him a lot of work. Upon learning that today he was just going for a walk, the boy calmed down and decided to meet the children. The Duke introduced the Crown Prince and the Princess, which left the young man completely surprised. It turned out that the boy's name was Bob, and he was the one who managed the district from the top of Hirn. Since His Highness had come anyway, Bob wanted to give Christopher some documents to review. He expected that, while he was away for a moment, the children would wait calmly without leaving the room. He truly believed that as long as they were there, nothing could happen to them. This was the case until suddenly, while looking thoughtfully out the window, Hanny saw something terrible, abruptly getting up from the chair. She greatly frightened Oswald, leaving him confused. Running to the street, she hoped the boy would call Christopher as quickly as possible. Despite Oswald's objections, she could not ignore the mistreatment of an adult towards a child. Running out, the protagonist desperately started looking for the knights who were accompanying them. Turning the corner, she finally saw Scott and the others, who were surprised to see her arrive. The knights didn't understand why the young princess was alone on the city street. It was too dangerous, and Scott wanted to know exactly what had happened to her. Grabbing the young knight by the hands, she started begging him to go with her and help the poor girl. Scott looked confusedly at the other warriors, who nodded silently, taking the young lady in their arms. He and the others quickly headed towards where she indicated. Suddenly, Hanny saw a terrifying scene in front of her, which made her disobey the Duke's order. Furious because the little girl denied having money, the adult threw her aside. Not believing her, he took a glass bottle to force her to hand over the money. However, according to the girl, the man had already taken everything from her 2 days ago. In tears, she began to beg him to come to his senses, because it was impossible to raise more money in such a short time. Determined to check the story, the man raised the bottle to threaten the girl. But suddenly, a knight grabbed his arm, considering that this method was too dangerous. At the same time, Scott turned Honey away so she wouldn't see what was happening. He also asked the victim to turn around, promising to take care of everything. The man started to get agitated, insulting the knights, and trying to break free. Then, one of them made a quick move, and with a precise blow, she took the bottle from the unfortunate man's hands. Seeing that it was a girl, the enraged man lunged at her with his fists, blocking the blow without problems. The female knight left the man completely bewildered, knocking him down and giving him a strong kick. She slammed him against the wall of the house, clutching the spot where he was hit. The man was trembling with pain and sheer terror. Then another knight approached and pointed his sword at her head, hoping that would finally calm him down. Suddenly, the man saw the same bottle next to him that had been taken from his hand. Mad with fear and rage, he shouted at the soldiers not to interfere in what was none of their business, and threw the bottle forward. Scott managed to catch it just a second before it reached Haney's head. With a sinister smile, the knight thought the man had crossed all boundaries now. After that, the man's painful groans could be heard from behind the princess, so she covered her ears. Taking out a rope, the knights decided to do things right, and they tied him up, beaten beyond recognition. The man, even tied up, kept insulting the heroes. Then Scott couldn't take it anymore and knocked him out with a blow to the neck, leaving everyone in shock. Annie looked at the injured girl, in whose eyes distrust was apparent, and contempt. The princess decided to make sure the rescued little girl was okay. The girl realized that it was the princess who asked the soldiers for help. But did the naive heroine really think the girl would be grateful to her for that? She didn't care about that help at all, and she looked at her rescuers with disdain. Seeing an aristocrat helping someone is no longer pleasant, and it hurts more when it's done out of pure greed. Fearing that all the anger would then fall on her and her mother, the girl asked for the heroine's compassion back. Annie tried to explain that she acted out of true empathy, but the girl didn't want to hear anything. It bothered her to receive compassion from someone who walks around with 3 guards and asks to be called madam. Seeing that the knights tensed up, the heroine signaled them not to intervene. The girl was right in saying that Hanny knew nothing about that world, but she knew very well what it hurt like to be hit. That's why she went to help. She became curious to know if the girl knew Princess Hanny, Eleonora's daughter, which scared her a lot. Seeing that reaction, the heroine showed her hand, full of scars from the constant blows. Before, Hanny felt so much pain that she wanted to die. But thanks to the help of others, now she could live happily. Among those others were also the 3 knights accompanying her, and protected. That's why the princess wanted to help. Seeing an adult hurting a girl, it wasn't just an act of kindness from an ignorant aristocrat. The heroine wanted to share what she herself had received. So, Haney invited the girl to go together to the imperial palace, if her parents allowed it. At that moment, a furious Christopher appeared behind the protagonist carrying Oswald under his arm. Annie was happy to see them, but the girl got scared seeing more aristocrats arrive. Both heroes started asking questions at the same time, wanting to know what had happened, and if the princess was injured. The Duke was shocked by her sudden flight, while the little one just smiled guiltily. One of the knights offered to explain everything that happened to the lord in detail. However, looking at the girl and at the tied man, the hero was already beginning to suspect what had happened. After hearing the knight's account, the duke knew the victim was named Judy. She confessed that the man who attacked her was her own father. They never had to work, since their family had a shop inherited from their grandfather. At some point, the father became addicted to gambling. And when he ran out of money, he gambled the house and the shop, losing everything. Then the father started drinking and forced her and her mother to work to get money, which he would gamble again. The mother's friends and neighbors tried to help her get a divorce, but that only angered the man more. Judy knew she had no forgiveness for having offended His Highness, but the protagonist perfectly understood her feelings and hoped the girl would allow her to help her. Christopher supported the princess, thinking that if they had already started helping, they should finish what they had started. So Judy dared to ask for help so that her mother could get a divorce, even though the subject wasn't even discussed. Such an opportunity doesn't come often. That's why the Duke wanted the girl to ask for everything she could. Moreover, now Christopher and Jenny could completely help her with all the problems. Judy was shocked, still absorbing what she had heard, and unable to believe what was happening. Later, the heroes walked, discussing the protagonist's admission to the prestigious National Academy. Annie could calmly concentrate on her studies, while Christopher helped Judy. At that moment, Oswald and the princess started taking turns praising the hero, saying that he was great, intelligent, and rich. So the Duke decided to add that he also had power, and they all laughed together. However, he hoped that Hanny wasn't joking so that she would forget about the escape. That day, the princess had to return to the palace and learn 101 child safety rules. Judy's father was imprisoned, and she and her mother organized their lives so that the girl could enter the academy. The sudden changes in the family attracted the attention of the neighbors, who never knew who had helped them. In addition to classes with the teacher, now the protagonist was taking etiquette lessons with Mrs. Melissa. After studying so hard, Hanny's blood sugar dropped and she eagerly went for the sweets. Sitting at the table with the Empress, the girls suddenly saw Melissa start coughing hard. Suddenly, the Empress got up from her chair. She kept coughing and started complaining of pain. Hanny was shocked, not understanding what was happening, and desperately trying to think of a plan. Suddenly, the protagonist realized that the Empress had been pregnant the whole time. In her past life, Eleonora poisoned Melissa, killing the baby she was carrying as well. With time, the pregnancy was confirmed, and Frederick and Constanza came to congratulate the Empress. The children were there too, and Oswald was incredibly happy to know he would have a brother or sister. It had been 8 years since new grandchildren were born, so Constanza suggested having a party. Melissa thought it would be great if the whole country could rejoice at this event. But first, they had to visit the temple of the God of Light and pray for the baby's well-being. Annie also joined the congratulations, for which she received sincere thanks. The Empress could no longer wait to see how beautiful that baby would be at birth. Eleonora was gone. No one was going to poison the lady. But still, the protagonist felt great unease in her heart. A few days later, the Emperor, his wife and the children finally set off for the temple of the God of Light. Father Kelvin received them there, accompanied by monks from the temple. They greeted the distinguished guests with a bow, and to the servants of the God of Light, wishing them the strength of the wind. Kelvin suddenly fixed his gaze on the protagonist. Annie felt very disconcerted by this. While the father began to converse with the Emperor, Kelvin was pleased to learn that His Highness and the others had arrived healthy and safe. They spoke of formal matters, but it seemed that Frederick and the father were friends and felt comfortable together. After the chat, everyone headed to the main chapel, where there was a stone statue of the God of Light. First, everyone bowed, and then they purified their lips and hands with holy water. Then came the moment when when everyone began to pray on their knees. For a while, the protagonist watched everyone pray, closing her eyes and opening her heart to God. Then she directed her gaze to the statue of the God of Light, remembering the past. Before dying, she had prayed a lot, and now she was doing it again. Annie was almost sure that her prayer would not be heard, but she hoped that at least once God would not ignore her. The girl sincerely wished that Melissa's son and Frederick would be born safe and sound. When the ceremony ended, the emperor wanted to excuse himself for a moment to speak with Kelvin. Upon accepting, the father suggested that the children take a walk around the church grounds. While listening to his words about the beautiful flowers in the place, the protagonist felt something strange inside, as if something wasn't right. Unlike her, Oswald looked at Kelvin with wide eyes, as if he were hypnotized. The girl didn't understand why they had to go somewhere. But suddenly, the crown prince insisted that they go for a walk. As they left, Honey couldn't shake the feeling that the Holy Father had been watching her strangely. Suddenly, a terrifying thought came to her mind: that Kelvin might discover her abilities. Scott and his partner accompanied the children, and the knight wouldn't stop admiring the spring landscapes the whole way. Scott thought he would like to have a little brother like Oswald, and his partner would be happy with a sister who knew fencing. Suddenly, a garden of indescribable beauty appeared before the heroes, full of fragrant flowers and spring colors. The children were paralyzed with awe, and the adults opened their mouths impressed. Putting on a thoughtful face, Oswald remembered that this must be somewhere around. Without understanding what he was looking for there, the protagonist suddenly felt a shadow completely cover her. Something flew past like a lightning bolt right over their heads, leaving everyone bewildered. The knights immediately ran towards the princess and the crown prince to protect them from an unexpected enemy. Scott grabbed Haney and made a sharp jump, moving away quickly to the side. Then he fell to the ground, holding the little one in front of him and pressing her against his chest. Whatever it was, the hero was glad that the attempt to harm the children had failed. His partner wanted them to stay there while she dealt with the enemy. But suddenly, to her surprise, the boy thought what happened wasn't that serious. Looking at the place where the unexpected visitor landed, the knight was petrified with amazement. In front, between them and Scott with Honey, stood an enormous tiger with a four-pointed star on its forehead. The princess cautiously watched the giant furry creature, not understanding who it was or where it came from. It was the sacred creature of this place, blessed by the God of Light, and its name was Light. Hearing this from Oswald, the heroine didn't understand why the sacred tiger suddenly appeared in front of her. Seeing that Light started approaching the princess, Scott stood between them, drawing his sword. Annie thought that because of her power, the tiger saw her as an enemy to be eliminated. Oswald hurried to calm the heroes, since according to him, Light had no intention of attacking. On the contrary, the tiger was very happy to see them. But it got annoyed because they blocked its way. Approaching the boy, Light extended its paw as a greeting, which greatly surprised him. But suddenly, Oswald raised his index finger and scolded the tiger because Light had almost hurt Annie, so he should think carefully about his behavior. The tiger's ears immediately drooped. It closed its eyes, and a lonely tear rolled down its cheek. Approaching the heroine, the boy first made sure she wasn't actually injured. Annie thought she was fine thanks to Scott, although the hero was convinced that he was just doing his duty. Moreover, compared to what Commander Drake usually does, this was nothing. But Haney kept praising him, and Oswald joined her. That kind of praise was the best thing the young knight could receive in his service. Although it made him somewhat nervous, suddenly the tiger stealthily approached from behind the princess and pushed her with its head, startling her quite a bit. Its eyes were very kind, although according to Oswald, Light was especially mischievous today. Getting closer to Haney, the boy thought that probably she also felt something strange when Kelvin sent them here. So the heroine understood that he knew everything, and that he was guided by his intuition. Annie looked closely at Oswald and Light, who had received the blessing of the God of Light. She found that pair incredibly cute. Although this left the knights completely confused. How could a 4-meter tiger, with a tail thicker than a doll, seem cute? Light approached the girl and rested its snout on her little hands. Then it started to purr. Of course, she had seen wild animals in the snowy mountain. But this one transmitted warmth to her, as if it were the sun. The children together began to stroke the happy predator, which had an expression of pure pleasure in its eyes. The obedient kitten gave them its paw, which left the heroes completely fascinated. Scott had heard that this creature was not exactly friendly, so now he was really surprised. But Hanny thought it was just a big cat and stray that needed affection and attention. Suddenly, the confused exclamation of Captain Drake was heard from the side. The Emperor, accompanied by the captain and the church servants, was heading towards them. Seeing the tiger, Drake demanded an explanation of what was happening there. Patting his forehead, Kelvin thought it had been a very long time since Light had appeared here. Frederick and the others noticed that. Next to the kitten, the princess looked tiny. Annie was indignant, as she didn't consider herself small. And then the Emperor apologized personally. The Holy Father promised that henceforth they would be more careful, and they would try to prevent something like this from happening. If the day came when the girl needed his help, Kelvin was ready to compensate for his mistake. The protagonist remembered it, thinking it might be useful if her power manifested someday. Suddenly, the tiger approached her and licked the palm of her hand, closing its eyes playfully. Annie took it as an apology, while the servants, including Kelvin, were shocked, because they knew this animal as a capricious one that wouldn't even let them touch it. When Frederick gave the order to leave, Light's eyes suddenly changed. It was very hard for him to say goodbye to the girl, even to tears, but there was nothing to do. So, Honey tied one of her ribbons on its little paw, hoping the tiger would keep it until they saw each other again. Along with all the servants, Light went out to see the heroes off and waved its paw with the ribbon to say goodbye. The next morning, the princess was sleeping peacefully in her bed and dreaming beautiful things. Suddenly, in her dreams, the girl felt her hand touch something that felt like fur, hugging what felt like a soft cloud. And warm, the protagonist sighed sweetly. Suddenly, a thought crossed her mind, and she woke up instantly, jumping up and throwing off the blanket. She screamed in surprise upon seeing a small tiger. But at that very moment, she recognized Light in the visitor and was very happy to see him. The protagonist was surprised that the tiger could make itself so small, like a simple orange cat. After saying this, Light made an elegant move and gracefully jumped from the bed to the floor. Upon touching the floor, it turned back into an enormous tiger and smiled at Honey. The princess understood that he had been punished yesterday for throwing himself at her in that way. Honey thanked Light for coming, but if anyone else saw him, a scandal would break out. Just at that moment, Gerda entered very happily, wanting to wake up the princess. Seeing the huge tiger next to the bed, she froze and screamed in terror. Regaining her composure, she asked His Highness not to make a single noise. Throwing herself on the floor, the maid crawled like a spy towards the bed, looking at the animal fearfully. Grabbing the girl, she ran out of the room at full speed, screaming desperately for help. Because of her screams, a great commotion broke out in the palace, and everyone was confused. Later, alone with Honey and Light, Frederick heard the story of his sudden appearance, calmly holding the kitten in his arms. The princess was sure that he had come to see her. What surprised the Emperor most was that the tiger had even brought his things, neatly arranged in a basket. That meant that, apparently, Light didn't intend to return. Realizing where the conversation was heading, the little tiger jumped out of the heroine's arms and ran to the basket, rummaging through his things. Light took out a large emerald and, with a satisfied look, handed it to the Emperor. Frederick understood that, apparently, they hadn't noticed his absence in the temple yet. But Light had to return, yes. Or yes. So, the Emperor decided to speak privately with the cat. and asked Haney to leave for a moment. The hero waited for the girl to leave the office before starting to speak. Looking at the cat, the emperor confessed that even he couldn't decide the fate of divine goods. And even if he could, the fact that the sacred beast had left the temple for the princess would benefit no one. In that case, Haney would receive much more attention than before. That could help her status. But considering her ice powers, it could also cause her more problems than advantages. From Light's look, Frederick understood that the cat saw no problem with what he had just heard. However, Haney was also the next candidate for the throne, after Oswald and Christopher. And if her name was associated with a divine creature, aristocrats with hidden motives could take advantage of it. As an older brother, Frederick thanked the cat for its kindness towards his sister. But he didn't want to complicate things further. Hoping he would understand, the emperor ordered Light to return to the temple immediately. Realizing there was no other option, the cat disappeared into the air, leaving behind a golden trail. Seeing the basket that remained, Frederick wondered if Light had forgotten it, or if he had decided not to give up. Calling Charles, the emperor ordered him to take the basket back to the temple and make sure no rumors spread. 2 weeks later, Frederick was back in his office working on documents. Suddenly, a reddish cat appeared out of nowhere. It perched on the desk and looked at the ruler seriously. The emperor expected the animal to have the decency to immediately get off the floor. Suddenly, the cat spat an envelope in front of Frederick and then calmly left the desk. The letter was from Kelvin in person, and it was completely drooled over by the cat. It said that this animal wouldn't be stubborn for no reason, and that it was better for him to stay in the palace. Upon hearing that, after reading the letter, the emperor admitted his defeat. Light jumped with joy, but its fur stood on end when it heard that Frederick had 2 conditions. Only by fulfilling them could the cat stay here. Otherwise, he would have to return. Sitting down and perking up its ears, Light prepared to listen carefully to His Highness. The first condition was that no one, except for the imperial family and the closest allies, knew about the presence of the sacred animal. The second condition was much more important than the first, and the emperor leaned in to whisper it. After stating both conditions, Frederick noticed that the tiger's gaze became more serious. Taking a step forward, Light raised its head and stared intently into the emperor's eyes. Frederick took this as a sign that negotiations were over. Seeing how the cat calmly licked its paw, something felt strange to the emperor. Suddenly, Hanny entered his office. Happy to see Light, Frederick couldn't understand what the divine animal was so interested in regarding this girl. The protagonist became very excited upon learning that the tiger would stay to live in the palace. He was very insistent. But if anything happened, Frederick could simply pretend that nothing had happened and send the cat back. Annie never dreamed of being liked so much by Light, nor of being able to spend so much time together. The emperor couldn't help but soften seeing how friends promised to get along always. Now he thought there was nothing strange about a divine being liking such a wonderful child. Moreover, now the princess had a quite reliable bodyguard. A month later, when it was first known that there was ice on top of Hirn, the reaction was mostly negative. This was because the ice business had a reputation for quickly leading businessmen to bankruptcy. However, Christopher managed to become #1 in the market in just 1 month, thanks to stability and low prices. He also managed to equalize ice prices, regardless of the season, and eliminate illegal traders, thanks to the Duke's contacts. And now, sitting in the pavilion next to his brother, he felt like he was neither alive nor dead. Frederick understood that in that state, it was surely difficult to engage in business. Not far from them on the lawn, Melissa was sitting with the children, laughing and chatting animatedly. Christopher had already heard rumors about the divine beast, and he wanted to see it, but surely right now it was napping somewhere. At first, the emperor worried about him, but now he understood that his fears were unfounded. He got along so well with Haney that the cat was willing to bring her a basket full of jewels. The Duke was bewildered. not understanding where the animal got all that from. Did he perhaps rob the Holy Father? But it turned out that all those riches truly belonged to him. It was strange, because normally the divine beings in the temple are not interested in human jewels. But this cat was different, and he was willing to do anything just to win the protagonist's love. A short time ago, the children gave the tiger a new nickname, since the name Light symbolized his relationship with the god of light. Upon learning that they called him Puff, Christopher almost choked on his tea. Although the tiger was still a child by divine beast standards, being the size of a house, the name Puff didn't suit him very well. Meanwhile, Melissa and the children kept laughing and chatting animatedly about different topics. Annie was curious. Did the lady want a boy or a girl? Thinking about it, the Empress decided that she would have preferred a daughter first, since she already had a son. But now she didn't care who it was, because Annie was like a real daughter to Melissa. From so much tenderness, steam almost came out of the protagonist's ears, and she turned completely red, which made the Empress laugh. Oswald was sitting with an expression of genuine joy, laughing with the others. The Duke watched the boy attentively, turning several ideas over in his mind, and deciding to talk to him. Frederick was surprised that he wanted to take Oswald with him, since he planned to make more ice with Haney's help. However, Christopher insisted that today, yes, or he would take the Crown Prince with him. Later, the Duke helped him pack his things while they talked. The boy was surprised that his uncle helped him, knowing how tired he was. Suddenly, the Duke became curious to know if the prince felt unhappy about having to share everything with Haney, because until then absolutely everything in the family had been his alone since he was born. Thinking about it, the boy remembered that they had already asked him that question when Haney first arrived at the palace. At that time, a maid wanted to know what Oswald thought if the princess made everyone love him less in the family. However, he was sure that the fact that Dad and Mom loved the girl did not mean they would love him less. The Crown Prince never thought he was sharing anything with her. On the contrary, together they received enough love. And this applied not only to the two of them and Haney, but also to the baby who had not yet been born. Oswald thought his uncle had nothing to worry about. Meanwhile, Christopher was in shock. After laughing, he realized that today he had got to know his nephew better. Grabbing him and starting to hug him tightly, he left Oswald completely confused. And when he called him his little one, Oswald was even more surprised, because his parents were Frederick and Melissa. Standing behind the door, Hanny heard that Christopher considered his brother's son his own as well. The protagonist had decided to arrive early and bring a bag of ice. But now everything had taken an unexpected turn. The Crown Prince didn't even imagine how much strength his sincere love gave the girl. And although she was still afraid, and she wasn't sure, thanks to how bright the boy was, the protagonist could advance even from the shadows. Annie wanted the baby who would soon be born to also receive so much love. The next day, sitting at the table, Melissa was distracted from the newspaper to say something to the princess. But to her surprise, the little one was sleeping soundly, leaning back in the chair. Upon hearing the Empress's voice, the girl immediately jumped up, pretending she wasn't asleep. Melissa suggested canceling classes so she could rest. But Hanny was eager to study, apologizing for having worried everyone. The protagonist hurried to her lesson. While watching the princess leave, Melissa thought she probably felt unwell due to the change of season, and she became seriously worried about her and the prince. So she decided to write a letter to Christopher and prepare a medicinal infusion for the children. It seemed that this year's summer was passing especially quickly, perhaps due to the amount of things that were happening. The Empress believed that this year, truly, it would remain engraved in her memory forever. Meanwhile, someone in a dark cloak was in front of the palace entrance, observing everything that was happening. In a dimly lit room, Melissa's body lay on the floor. She could barely keep breathing. Agnes arrived just in time. She managed to neutralize the poison and save the Empress. but the baby in her womb was already dead. Upon receiving this news, the protagonist felt overwhelming terror and total despair. Eleonora, like a monster, hugged the little one's body and let out a sinister laugh. The woman didn't understand how such a horrible being as Haney could dare to think she deserved to be happy. At that moment, the girl woke up soaked in cold sweat, trembling with fear all over her body, with difficulty breathing. Little by little, she began to recover from what she had seen. That night, she couldn't sleep well again, and she started rubbing her eyes tiredly. The fact that Eleonora had died did not mean that everything was over. The woman's accomplice, who helped her poison the Empress, was still in the palace. The problem was that the little girl knew absolutely nothing about him. Her mind was a mess, and she decided to go out for some fresh air. It was pitch black outside, and upon hearing a noise in the distance, the girl became alert. There she saw a person observing the palace, dressed in a dark cloak. On the back of the cloak, there was a drawing of a ram's skull, which made it look even more sinister. Remembering something, Hanny fell to the ground, paralyzed by the fear that suddenly invaded her. Because before, she had already encountered that cloak. Just before returning. That time, she was wandering through the palace where she lived with her mother, looking for something to eat. Suddenly, she saw a person wearing that cloak at the end of the hallway, talking with Eleonora. She managed to hear that they were working on something, and the woman agreed to wait a little. At that moment, the girl was hiding behind a nearby dresser, and she didn't understand who that person was, nor what that cloak was. And now it was happening again, at the same time with the same clothes. And furthermore, the stranger's behavior was very suspicious. The protagonist had almost no doubt that this was Eleonora's accomplice. However, at that distance, it was impossible to see their face. Besides, they had their back turned. If you looked at the skirt, it seemed like someone from the staff, sitting on the grass and sighing sadly. Hanny thought it would be great to know more. She felt it was her duty to discover the identity of the person in the cloak and protect Miss Melissa. Suddenly Puff appeared, and the protagonist stared at him. The idea occurred to her to send the cat to the Empress as a personal bodyguard. The girl hoped the divine beast would grant her request, because only he could protect the lady without anyone noticing. The cat meowed affirmatively, and the little one, thanking him, let him go. At that very instant, he vanished into the air, leaving behind a golden glow. Suddenly, the girl heard a strange noise, and the crunching of leaves behind her. She got very scared, realizing that it seemed someone else had decided to come. Hidden, she began to observe from her refuge to see who would come out of the woods. Suddenly, another person in a dark cloak came out, but this time without drawings. Thinking it was another accomplice of Eleonora, the protagonist tried to see their face. Upon seeing that it was a small boy, Haney exclaimed in surprise. At that very moment, she realized they had just discovered her. Noticing that the boy had red hair, the protagonist suddenly understood everything. The hero was greatly surprised to meet his sister here, coming out of her hiding place and looking at him confusedly. Haney was also surprised to see Terence in this place. Although the former emperor had an adult wife, Constanza, with 2 sons, took 2 more wives. Upon dying, he left 4 descendants. Among them Hanny, daughter of Eleonora, and Terence, son of the second wife. And now, the protagonist unexpectedly ran into the little ex-prince. She didn't understand what the boy was doing here, since his family rarely appeared in public. After thinking a bit, Terence decided he couldn't tell his little sister about it. Moreover, the princess was here in pajamas, not to mention the slippers. Being part of the royal family, the protagonist had to behave like one. Annie was shocked by such impudence, not understanding how someone could look at others like that. She admitted that she had only gone out for some fresh air and ended up here. After that, an awkward silence filled the atmosphere, making the girl feel uncomfortable. Realizing that she probably had nothing more to say, Terence turned around and started to leave. The princess knew that it was about a 40-minute walk to his palace, That meant the boy was hiding something. Could his family also be involved in the poisoning? The next morning, the little one was standing by the window, remembering what happened during the night. And then she went to see Melissa. She was worried about Terrence's unexpected visit. But the most important thing now was to protect the Empress. Knowing that the culprit could be one of the maids, Hanny suddenly ran into them in the hallway. The girls were carrying boxes, and they didn't understand why the princess was there at that hour. The protagonist stared at the maids, who smiled kindly in response. The girl knew little about them. Only that one of the maids had been working for the Empress for a long time. Seeing her serious face, the girls thought that Her Highness must have had something important to do. They believed that Jenny was in her pajamas because her servants weren't doing their job properly. But the girl reassured them. She had simply had a nightmare about her mother and decided to go see Mrs. Melissa as soon as possible. Moved by what they heard, the maids decided to split up. One would accompany the young princess, and the other would take care of the medicines. Annie was very surprised to learn that in their boxes there was medicine that Christopher had sent at the Empress's request. Upon hearing the Duke's name, the little one froze in fear, turning many thoughts over. Now, if she wasn't careful, malicious people might even try to blame Christopher. After that, she went as fast as she could to the Empress. Melissa didn't expect such an early visit from the little princess, and she was surprised. The protagonist wished her a good morning and was happy to see the lady full of energy and in good health. The Empress became curious to know what caused such an early visit. With a sad look, the girl confessed that she had had a nightmare. That's why she decided to stay with Melissa, which made her get up immediately and run towards the little one, hugging the girl tightly. The Empress tried to push all the horrible thoughts from the dream out of her head, because, according to her, it was just a dream that would never come true. At that moment, Hanny remembered how Melissa's body lay on the floor, almost lifeless. However, she believed that, just as the lady said, that dream was not meant to come true. The Empress ordered the servants to inform the princess's palace where she was, bring her clean clothes, and prepare breakfast. In addition, she wanted the maids to prepare a medicinal infusion for her to take after eating. It turned out that this concoction was for the little one, as a way to take care of her health. The protagonist was shocked to learn this, thinking that if the medicines were for her, then what about the poison? Upon learning that part of the medicine was also for Oswald, Haney got scared, thinking he was sick. But in reality, Melissa thought it wouldn't hurt him either to have an extra boost for his immunity. After all, the boy had a special power, which left the little one completely confused. When he was born, he was very weak. But then he started to improve. And now there were no problems. Even so, Melissa remained worried, like any mother, and she cared for Hanny just the same. That's why she hoped that, even if the concoction tasted bitter, the girl could endure it for a while. After that, the princess stayed with Melissa, waiting for the servants who were supposed to bring her clean clothes. She was happy because today she could spend the whole day with the Empress. Now there was no way to check the kitchen, so all that was left was to stay close and not let her guard down. Soon, two maids arrived together, which surprised the lady a little. One of them, the one who had worked with the Empress the longest, had already told everything in the kitchen, and breakfast was almost ready. Melissa was grateful and happy that everything was fine. But there was something that worried the girls. They spent a long time thinking about whether they should tell the Empress. And in the end, they decided to confess. Apparently, the third maid had some kind of problem. That's why she always looked sad. The other servants couldn't find out anything. And then Melissa decided to pay attention to her personally. Furthermore, the girls remembered that this maid had gone out at night somewhere. This was demonstrated by the fact that her coat was not in its place at that moment. The little one was horrified to think that surely that person in the cloak was her. Suddenly, the door was knocked on, and it turned out to be exactly the maid they were talking about. Finally, everyone was gathered, and both ladies headed to the dining room. Sitting at the table, the first thing they did was have several waiters bring them pickled mushrooms as a light appetizer. The protagonist was completely tense, waiting attentively for the moment of poisoning. However, the food was fine, and the empress and the princess started eating. Looking at the downcast maid they were talking about earlier, it was evident that something was wrong with her. But would someone planning a murder really be that nervous? Suddenly, the protagonist noticed the furious gaze of the maid, who had been working with Melissa the longest. With just that look, the girl's hand started shaking so much she couldn't use the cutlery. The empress, for her part, ate breakfast calmly, with a completely carefree expression. Suddenly, the empress picked up the glass of water, which made Hanny even tenser. At that moment, the girl remembered that the poison was in the cup with the hot drink. Something had to be done urgently. But unfortunately, the protagonist couldn't warn His Majesty about anything. Just then, one of the maids brought a tray with 2 cups of infusion. Melissa had only asked for 1. But the person who gave the infusion to the maid thought the future baby would also benefit from something healthy. The empress thought it was a very sweet gesture from the girl, and accepted it happily. Annie watched closely as the maid placed both cups on the table, suspecting her. But the girl was surprised that it was precisely that maid, who had been working for the lady for over 10 years, measuring the temperature of the drink with a probe. The girl suggested the little one do the same. Upon accepting, the protagonist noticed how the maid watched her very cautiously in every move. When taking out the rod, she accidentally touched the cup, tipping it over onto the table and spilling its contents. Annie started apologizing, but Melissa calmed her down, since the important thing was that it hadn't spilled onto the clothes. In that case, she asked the maid to prepare the infusion again, and the girl accepted with a smile. After she left, the protagonist had a little time to try to inform His Majesty of everything. The first thing the little one did was open the window and call her pet, hoping he could help her. Stroking his snout, she was glad that Pufik was safe, and hoped everything was well with him. She decided to send a letter to the emperor through him. Although there was no paper nearby, there was no other option, so the protagonist wrote the letter directly on a table napkin. Now, the cat had to urgently go before His Majesty and deliver the message as quickly as possible. Just as he disappeared, one of the maids wanted to change His Majesty's clothes. She was a girl named Fedora, about whom they said she had been looking downcast lately. After dressing Mrs. Hanny in a dress, she asked her to stay a moment to tell her something. However, at the same time she started to hesitate, as if she couldn't find the right words. Holding her hand, Fedora, with a face full of desperation, looked at the floor. So the girl decided to ask directly if the girl knew there was something in the infusion. After that, the maid's face filled with horror, and her whole body was covered in cold sweat. It turned out it wasn't her doing, since she would never have done such a thing. Fedora confessed that there was poison in the cup with the infusion, which left the protagonist in shock. The girl regretted it very much, and it was clear that she seemed to have been forced to participate. It wasn't the moment, but later the protagonist hoped to hear the details of what happened from her. Furthermore, Hanny was sincerely grateful to the girl for her bravery and for confessing. Thanks to her, the princess was now completely sure, and she ran back to the empress. Upon returning, the girl didn't know if it was better to tell everything right now and ask for help. At that moment, Melissa was sitting in front of the protagonist and reading a magazine calmly. Hanny decided not to say it directly. She didn't want to just blurt it out. In the end, the truth would come to light, and the little one hoped it wouldn't be a very hard blow for the lady. Seeing the maid enter again with a tray, the protagonist decided to wait for the right moment. After checking the temperature, the maid offered drinks, but Hanny suddenly refused. She asked for the infusion to be cooled down a bit more, which the empress found amusing. So Melissa decided to try it first. But suddenly, the princess screamed and jumped up. The maid and the empress looked at her confusedly, surprised by that reaction. Not wanting to wait any longer, the protagonist took a silver watch out of her pocket. Then she began to dip it intensely into the cup with the infusion, hoping the silver would reveal if there was poison. Melissa, not understanding anything, looked at the maid, who had an unperturbed expression. At that moment, the maid started to suspect the little one. When taking the watch out of the cup, Haney, to her surprise, saw that it was in perfect condition. Then the maid burst out laughing, thinking the princess was having nightmares again. But suddenly, the girl asked the maid to give her a handkerchief. The girl didn't understand why, but the protagonist started to insist. Annie knew that checking the poison that way made no sense. Surely the maid did something where the cup touched the lips. By wiping the cup first, and then the watch with a handkerchief, both started to darken rapidly before their eyes. It was now an undeniable fact that there was poison in the cup, and the girl directed her gaze towards the Empress. Melissa's face filled with terror, and she couldn't take her eyes off the watch. At that very moment, the maid abruptly grabbed Haney's hand and pulled with all her strength. After that, she threw the girl to the floor, making the Empress jump up. The maid was furious, not understanding how that brat could have discovered it. Suddenly, she lifted her skirt. She pulled out a knife tied to her leg and apologized to the Empress in advance. Melissa looked horrified at the maid, who had worked for her longer than the others, refusing to believe what was happening. The maid screamed because she never wanted things to go this far. The protagonist understood that it was already too late to try to stop the assassin, and the guards hadn't arrived yet. The only option was to use the girl's ice power. There was no other way out, and the protagonist began to concentrate ice magic in her hand. Then she created a sphere of ice, preparing to freeze the assassin. At that very moment, the door burst open, and the knights appeared in the doorway. Led by Captain Drake, the maid was ordered to drop the weapon immediately and raise her hands above her head, knowing that the maid was still dangerous. The girl ran quickly and pushed her. Due to surprise, the girl immediately fell to the floor, and the knife fell from her hand. She looked furiously at the protagonist, enraged because of that brat. But at that very moment, several knight swords pointed directly at the assassin, giving her no chance to move. The Empress looked at her maid confusedly, who until now had been the most loyal. Haney and Melissa watched as the knights took away the criminal, who started screaming hysterically and struggling. At that very moment, the Emperor entered, looking scared at the Empress and the princess. The first thing he wanted was to make sure the girls hadn't been injured. Seeing that they were safe and sound, Frederick hugged his wife tightly, and his little sister. Now the Empress couldn't stay in that palace, and she had to see a doctor as soon as possible. Anilos looked uncomfortable, wanting to tell the Emperor something. But suddenly, Melissa interrupted her mid-sentence and hugged her tightly and tenderly. The Empress also had many questions, but she understood that the little one only wanted to protect her. That's why, although Hanny's actions were reckless, the Empress thanked her for her bravery and for saving her. The heroine was also glad to have managed to stop the assassin. But now she felt incredible tension from the Emperor. Suddenly, Frederick decided it was now the princess's turn, which sent a shiver down her spine. He didn't understand how she knew who the culprit was, what poison was, and why she decided to act alone. So, the heroine asked if the Emperor knew that lately she had been falling asleep anywhere. Frederica felt, thinking it was due to the high fever. But it turned out that was just an excuse, because the girl could tell that every night she had nightmares where Melissa fainted from the poison. For that very reason, she went for a walk at night, to calm her anxiety. Besides, she thought her premonitions were just a coincidence, and she wrote everything else down in a letter. Annie did not deny her guilt, but she wanted to go to the Emperor as soon as she found any clue about the culprit. At first, she thought it was just a nightmare. Then she started to suspect the maids, and then she noticed many strange things. There was no way to act quickly, because that maid was always nearby. So the girl decided to send a letter. But the maid still managed to prepare the concoction. So the protagonist decided to stop her. Annie started to tremble and cry. Realizing the danger, she had exposed the Empress too. However, Frederick did not want her to blame herself. Besides, Melissa was also grateful to her. A great misfortune could truly have happened. So the Emperor personally thanked the protagonist. To his surprise, the girl decided she would rather not hear those words again. After all, she was just protecting her dear family. And she wasn't doing it to receive thanks. Impressed by those words, Frederick apologized and promised not to say it again, knowing that it had already been difficult enough for the little one to do everything alone. He decided to send her to rest. Meanwhile, the knights arrived with the report that they had found evidence in the kitchen. The Emperor thought that was not for a girl's ears, so he asked Drake to take her with him. Later, Agnes arrived in the kitchen, and after analyzing the poison, she discovered that the symptoms only appeared after an incubation period. It has no color, no smell, and no clear symptoms to distinguish it from other poisons. If the Empress had ingested the poison, neither she nor anyone else would have noticed the poisoning. No evidence would have remained. So not even Agnes would have been able to identify the poison or do anything. After that, for a few seconds, a tense silence filled the air. Frederick understood that if this poison was so difficult to detect, it could already be anywhere in the palace. Therefore, the palace had to be closed as soon as possible, and the imperial family evacuated. However, Agnes and Drake also knew that a simple maid couldn't have obtained that poison alone. What if the culprit was now going after not only Melissa, but also the entire imperial family? Meanwhile, Viola received the lady at the palace. Having already heard what happened, now she wanted the protagonist to change clothes as soon as possible and get a good rest from everything. At that moment, the servants announced that Fedora had arrived to see the princess. The maid looked at Viola insecurely, wanting to tell Haney something. Suddenly, she dropped to her knees and bowed to the floor, leaving the girls confused. Fedora never imagined that this woman would threaten Mrs. Melissa. She also understood that this was a mortal sin that could not be forgiven. However, Fedora's younger sisters were not to blame, and she began to beg them to protect them. The princess had no intention of interrogating her. She just wanted to hear everything she knew. It turned out that Fedora was just an observer, and if they failed, she had to commit the murder herself. She didn't want to do it at all, but her father gave her no other choice. The maid who tried to poison the lady knew nothing about Fedora or who was behind it. Honey assumed it might be the Terrence family, which made the maid freeze in fear. However, she didn't want to say anything, understanding that the little one couldn't bear it. At that moment, Honey remembered that she was still a young princess and defenseless. No matter what, the little one promised to protect Fedora's siblings, asking in return that everything be reported to the Emperor. The girl was very grateful to the princess for trusting her and for listening to her. The next day, Frederick ordered the palace to be closed, and the entire royal family evacuated. Melissa, Oswald, and Constanza immediately left for a distant family mansion. After that, an investigation among the palace staff began immediately. Since Haney was one of the main witnesses, the Emperor decided to keep her for a while to talk to her. After all, he wanted to understand how the little one discovered the culprit. The thing was that the maid checked the princess's hands to make sure she was right-handed. As soon as they entered the room, she prepared the infusion in a cup with a handle. And there Haney understood everything. The assassin decided to take advantage of the fact that the Empress was holding the cup with her left hand instead of her right. There was no poison in the infusion, but the maid observed which part of the mouth Melissa brought the cup to. That same cup was on the table, and Hanny pointed with her finger to the spot where the poison was. The protagonist did not check it, but she was sure that the same thing could happen with other cups. That was all the princess knew. And the Emperor asked Captain Drake to verify the information. Soon, all the protagonist's words were completely confirmed, leaving Frederick astonished. He, of course, knew that Hanny was smart, but he didn't even imagine how much. Thinking that she was just like him, the Emperor stroked the girl's head. Seeing Drake smile, Frederick didn't understand why the captain had such a brazen look. On top of everything, it was terrifying that the poison was in the box Christopher had sent. It seems the criminal not only wanted to frame the Duke, but also use the little one to deflect suspicion. If we assume that Melissa took the poison, and Hanny knew nothing, then there would be many suspects. That maid would be the first suspect, but she would be immediately cleared by what the princess said. She would claim she didn't put the poison in, and Hanny would confirm it. That's why she decided to let the girl try it first. Suddenly, the little one decided to tell Frederick another important detail. The Emperor was shocked, not understanding where his little sister got so much information from. The protagonist told the Emperor in detail everything related to Fedora. Frederick greatly valued the information she gave him. But he was very worried because the little one was so involved in all this. If all that was true, then whoever was behind this controlled the surrounding people. The first thing was to approach Fedora and find out everything possible about her. It was clear that the situation was serious. But now, the Emperor decided to be more attentive than ever. He still hadn't recovered from yesterday's events. When the criminal revealed who the client was, to Haney's surprise, the client turned out to be her mother Eleonora, which made the little one freeze. However, since Eleonora was dead, it was unlikely that she would be directly involved. Although perhaps she was still involved in some way. The protagonist understood that. Unlike the poison her mother got, this one was different, so someone else had obtained it. At that moment, Hanny remembered the unexpected encounter with Terence in the woods at night. They searched the assassin's room and found evidence of that deal. Now all that remained was to discover the connection with Eleonora. They had to be very careful until the culprit was found. And meanwhile, the Emperor decided to punish the woman's family. The little one feared that perhaps Eleonora acted without her family's help. But Frederick was sure that they were also involved. Their family were ruined aristocrats living off their modest fortune. After Eleonora's death, their link with the Emperor was broken, and they started engaging in illegal activities. All that time, the Emperor had turned a blind eye. But it was time to bring justice. Frederick knew that news could affect Haney, so he wanted her to leave for the mansion the next day. The next day, the Emperor sentenced the assassin to death and stripped Eleonora's family of their status and assets. A day later, when the news of what happened broke, the entire empire was in an uproar. Frederick looked with horror at the scorching headlines, completely baffled. Just as he thought, public opinion about Hanny was not the best. So she had to be sent to the mansion immediately. While packing her things, Viola didn't understand why the princess, who had saved the Empress's life, had to flee. But Hanny herself had no problem, since her family was at the mansion. Moreover, the area where the mansion was located was famous for its stunning scenery. Looking at the maid, the protagonist could not imagine the shock Melissa had suffered after the betrayal of her closest servant. When the carriage was ready, the things packed and the girls started to board, Drake suddenly knocked on the door. The captain's face was marked by horror, which left both protagonists in shock. First of all, he made sure the little one was feeling well, especially after the previous night. Drake sighed in relief upon learning that, after yesterday's encounter, Haney had returned safe and sound to her room. To the princess's horror, it turned out that Fedora had suddenly disappeared last night. She had been arrested as a suspect and was expected to be interrogated. But when they went to see her in the morning, there was no trace of the maid left. Now they were looking for her everywhere. And since the last person who saw her before being detained was Haney, Drake decided to come here. The Emperor even called Fedora's father about this, suspecting that her family might be involved in the escape. The little one was sure that the maid had not disappeared of her own free will, at which Drake sighed heavily. He also thought that the true perpetrator had eliminated Fedora to hide the truth. After the conversation, the captain hurried to send the protagonist to the mansion, escorted by knights. The girl wondered if that was exactly what Fedora feared, or if she had truly just escaped. Upon arriving at the mansion, Annie wondered what everyone was doing so late at night. Charles received them near the map, whom the protagonist hadn't seen for a long time, and wanted to know where the others were. The head butler apologized for what he was about to say, and it turned out that Mrs. Melissa had suffered a miscarriage. Annie froze, eyes wide open, while Viola covered her face in fright. Everything happened suddenly and very quickly. Her Highness should arrive here. Letting go of Viola's hand, the girl ran towards the mansion. But suddenly, her strength left her, and she collapsed on the way, plunged into deep despair. Charles personally accompanied the protagonists to the house, in an atmosphere of funereal silence. Upon entering the room, they saw Agnes, Constanza, Oswald, and Christopher standing by Melissa's bed. The Empress lay with her eyes closed, and her face, always radiant, was duller than ever. The Emperor's mother brought Hanny closer, and Oswald towards her, embracing them with her arms. The doctor did everything she could, relieving the abdominal pain and stopping the bleeding. Constanza didn't understand why Agnes had assured her a short time ago that Melissa and the grandson were fine. However, the miscarriage could have been due to stress, although sometimes it happens for no apparent reason. The only thing the healer was sure of was that the poison had nothing to do with this.